Chapter 2667. For the disciples of the Tao Masters, the timing of Luo Fan's appearance was obviously extremely bad. It should be known that the two strongest experts on their side were currently in an internal strife. Just looking at the battle between them made them feel unspeakable psychological pressure. Under such circumstances, the appearance of an enemy that was unbelievably powerful and could even force one of their strongest experts to the point of having no choice but to pay a huge price to summon his companions was like adding hail to snow, causing them to practically be unable to see any hope of victory. Under such circumstances, how could they not be afraid? How could they not feel despair? On the other hand, it was a different story for the rogue cultivators who had survived. For them, the appearance of Luo Fan meant that they finally saw a bright future in the darkness. The current situation of the Tao Sovereign's disciples was already extremely bad for them. All of the Tao Sovereign's disciples had fallen into the side effects of the means they had used before, and almost all of them couldn't move at all. However, the strongest experts were in an internal strife and were fighting each other fiercely. What a wretched sight to behold, however. This was only in the eyes of the disciples of the Tao Masters. For the individual cultivators, their views were completely opposite. For them, there were only a few hundred cultivators left on the side of the individual cultivators. Moreover, each of them was seriously injured. The lightest injury would take at least a few hours to recover. Those who were seriously injured might even need tens of thousands of years to fully recover. Under such circumstances, the strength of their side could be said to have fallen to the lowest point. On the other hand, the disciples of the Tao Masters opposite them seemed to have lost the ability to resist even if they were lying on the ground. However, that was obviously only temporary. As long as they could take a breather, all the disciples of the Tao Masters might be able to fully recover. At that time, all the disciples of the Tao Masters would join forces to deal with the hundreds of individual cultivators. There was no need to think about the final result. Just the existence of the disciples of the Tao Masters alone was enough to bring them great pressure. Not to mention that there were two disciples of at least 7 tribulation experts above the disciples of the Tao Masters. Even though the two 7 tribulation experts seemed to be having a strange dispute at this moment and were fighting, this kind of fight clearly had the nature of a game. In this kind of battle, no matter which side won, the other side would not be completely annihilated. As long as they weren't completely annihilated, this kind of battle would naturally be meaningless to them. Apart from that, even if both sides were heavily injured and each of them was tortured to death in that battle, in the end, they could still blow them and hundreds of 5th tribulation experts to death in one breath. Under such circumstances, there was only one fate awaiting these rogue cultivators, and that was failure. Any rogue cultivator who was slightly clear-headed would be able to clearly understand the situation. It was precisely because of this that before Luo Fan appeared, many of the rogue cultivators were actually in a state of unease. In fact, they were even vaguely filled with despair. It could be said that if it weren't for the fact that the price of being sealed by the Tao Master's prison was so great that it was even greater than the current failure, they might have already used all kinds of means to attract the power of the Tao Master's prison. As for the fact that they didn't prepare a backup plan or that there were problems with a backup plan, it was no longer a problem now that they had caught their breath. For them, it was not difficult to prepare some new backup plans and new preparations. Since it was not difficult, they could naturally do it at any time if they wanted to. In this dilemma, suddenly seeing the appearance of Luo Fan and Luo Fan's relaxed and expectant performance was a great encouragement to their fighting spirit. How could they not feel overjoyed at this time? How could they not feel that hope had suddenly emerged again? At this time, the 5th senior brother roared, "Two senior brothers, the enemy is coming." This roar directly penetrated the infinite brilliance of the 5th floor of the Tao Master's path, penetrated into the area of dimensional chaos, and went straight for the childlike 7 tribulation expert and the young-like 7 tribulation expert. However, although the 5th senior brother was quite powerful among the 5 tribulation experts, and could even be said to be standing at the peak level of the 5 tribulation experts. However, after all, he was only a 5 tribulation expert. Although the light of heaven and earth was considered to be complete, he couldn't even extract the power and divine sense he needed from the light of heaven and earth. He couldn't even really control the space-time inside the Tao Master's path. How could he have any impact on the dimensional means sublimated from the light of heaven and earth? At this time, although the words he roared were extremely vast and amazing outside the area of dimensional chaos, and even faintly turned into countless worlds after crashing into the area of dimensional chaos, they were completely wiped out by the chaotic dimensions in the area of dimensional chaos. All the sound waves were completely swallowed up and erased by the area of dimensional chaos. However, none of them really reached the ears of the childlike 7 tribulation expert and the young-like 7 tribulation expert. At this moment, the two of them were still engaged in a hand-to-hand battle that was completely unimaginable to ordinary cultivators. Their battle was so heroic. As they waved their hands, they simply fully displayed all the art of hand-to-hand combat in the universe. It was so much so that the power, space-time, karma, and everything else that he used had already reached an effect that ordinary 6 tribulation experts wouldn't be able to achieve even if they exhausted all of their power and used all of their means. Under such a battle, the chaos that existed in the dimensional chaos region became even more terrifying. The dimensional chaos naturally made the isolation between the inside and outside of the region even stronger. Under such circumstances, even if the 5th senior brother was in his peak state and added all his power and means to his shout, it was still impossible for his voice to really reach the ears of the two of them. Moreover, the 5th senior brother's current state was extremely poor. He had already paid a great price to be able to shout such a voice, which directly delayed the recovery of his injuries for tens of thousands of years. Unfortunately, you can't remind them at all. At this time, Luo Fan sighed. With a light step, he had already arrived in front of the many disciples of the Tao Masters. Previously, he had not thought of directly dealing with these disciples of the Tao Masters. After all, these disciples of the Tao Masters were almost the disciples of most of the Tao Masters on the 5th level of the Tao Masters path. With so many people, if he really killed all of them in one fell swoop, it would be too much of a stimulus for the disciples of the Tao Masters. Under such a stimulus, maybe the experts of the 8 tribulation and 9 tribulation would be attracted and directly deal with him. It was obviously not worth taking such a risk for these disciples of the Tao Masters. However, this was obviously just the original situation. Just now, after being plotted against twice by these disciples of the Tao Masters, Luo Fan no longer thought so. Since he was plotted against, he naturally had to return the favor. Even if he did not return at this time, he must find a chance to return the favor. This kind of thinking, for him, was really reasonable. At this time, everything that he had experienced at the moment of being plotted against was still vivid in his mind. At that time, if he had not made a prompt decision to completely dissipate all his existence in this level of reality before the palm of the old Taoist shadow really hit him, and let his essence hide in other levels, perhaps he would have been completely erased at that moment. However, even so, at that moment, he had suffered a very strong injury. That terrifying fluctuation directly passed through the barriers of the planes and transmitted to the many planes above, causing the many planes to instantly clash with each other in an inconceivable manner. It caused the corresponding existences on an unknown number of planes to completely collapse in that instant. Fortunately, his reaction was fast enough to cut off all existences in the level of reality, so that in the end, a large part of the impact was cut off in the level of reality. Although he had suffered a serious injury, in the end, there was still a part of the corresponding existence on the level of reality that survived. And it was also this survival that gave him the hope of a complete resurrection. Just now, when a young 7 tribulation expert appeared, the reason why he did not immediately appear was that he was working hard to restore his corresponding existence on other levels. He was working hard to maintain the degree of completeness on other levels. The reason why he appeared now was precisely because he had completely restored the corresponding existence on all levels. How do you want to die? Luo Fan looked at the disciples of the Tao Masters and asked indifferently. At this time, there was already a killing intent in his heart. It was not the first time for him to almost die, but this time it brought great stimulation to him. Of course, it was not because his mentality had exploded and he could no longer accept this kind of experience of almost dying. But this time, it was completely his own fault that he almost died this time. If he had cut off the means of these disciples long ago and destroyed the formation formed by these disciples, then he definitely would not have suffered this fate of almost dying. This was obviously his own mistake. In a way, the disciples of these Tao Masters did not make any mistakes. However, this kind of result of almost dying because of his own mistake was also unacceptable for Luo Fan. At this time, he had already woken up and knew that he was not qualified to calmly wait for his opponent to display their strongest strength like before. He was not qualified to fight with these disciples of the Tao Masters with a playful attitude. From a certain point of view, he should obviously be grateful to these disciples of the Tao Masters. However, after coming to a realization, Luo Fan naturally understood what kind of attitude he should use to face these disciples of the Tao Masters, or in other words, to face these enemies. That was to use all his strength to get rid of them. Only by getting rid of them would he be able to truly turn his understanding into his own code of conduct and completely absorb the harvest of almost dying. Therefore, at this time, what he had to do was to kill the countless disciples of the Tao Masters in front of him. As for what would happen after killing the disciples of these Tao Masters, whether he would encounter experts that he could not resist, and whether he would suffer attacks that he could not imagine, he could only think about it after he finished this matter. Feeling such a world-shattering, killing intent, the faces of the many disciples of the Tao Masters turned as pale as paper. Tao Masters, Fifth Tribulation experts, this was their identity. Every one of these identities was definitely not ordinary, and they all represented their own extraordinary status. However, this did not mean that they would not be afraid of death. It did not mean that they could completely look at the disappearance with a calm gaze, especially when the one who disappeared was themselves, and the one who died was also themselves. At this time, they clearly felt Luo Fan's killing intent towards them, and the incomparably strong killing intent of Luo Fan. How could they not feel fear in their hearts? At this moment, their eyes became a little desperate as they looked at Luo Fan. They were hungry. They did not know the real realm of Luo Fan, nor did they know that Luo Fan had not yet passed his seventh major tribulation. However, from the fact that Luo Fan could fight with the seventh tribulation expert whom they had painstakingly invited from the seventh floor of the road to Tao Master, they could tell how powerful and terrifying Luo Fan was. Now, such a powerful and terrifying existence wanted to kill them. How could they not feel desperate? How could they not feel that there was no light in the future? If I say I want to die of old age, will you agree? Fifth senior brother said with a wry smile at this time. It's easy to die of old age. If you want, I can help you. Luo Fan just said at this time, indifferently at this time. If an ordinary person said that he wanted to die of old age, especially in front of an enemy who was also an ordinary person, it was obviously just a kind of flirting, which naturally meant that he wanted the other party to let him go. However, that was only at the level of ordinary people. If this level was raised to the level of practitioners, to the level of sixth tribulation, or even seven tribulation experts like Luo Fan, the situation would obviously be different. Chapter 2668. Hearing Luo Fan's words, Fifth senior brother's eyes were filled with regret. The reason why he said that just now was because he had seen a conversation between mortals in one of the worlds he had created. That conversation was similar to the current situation. A certain villain had already forced the righteous opponent to the edge, to the point where he could finish him off at any time. Then, the villain asked the righteous opponent how he wanted to die, and the righteous opponent's answer was exactly what he said at this moment. This sentence had obviously left a deep impression on Fifth senior brother, so he would occasionally take it out to reminisce. Then, at this time, under the strong pressure of Luo Fan It seemed that he could be completely destroyed in the next moment and be completely erased. His mind was blank and instinctively took out the conversation that he occasionally recalled. In the end, it resulted in such an answer to Luo Fan at this moment. At this time, when he heard Luo Fan's words, he felt that something was wrong. Between mortals, this kind of conversation was naturally not a problem. Once it was said, the villain would definitely become angry out of embarrassment. However, at this time, when facing an existence at the level of Luo Fan, it was different. After all, it was a simple thing for an existence at the level of Luo Fan to make a cultivator die of old age. Even if the cultivator himself had exceeded the limit of lifespan and was no longer threatened by aging, it was still the same. In front of such an existence, saying that one wanted to die of old age seemed to be really asking to die of old age. At this time, Fifth Senior Brother could only smile bitterly and say, "It's just a joke. You don't have to be so serious." Only the Fifth Senior Brother could say something like that. He was such a person. If not for this kind of person, how could he, as the strongest among the disciples of the Tao Master on the 5th level, not be the Fifth Senior Brother? Instead, he pushed out several disciples of the Tao Master to rotate the position. "Do you think I should believe your previous sentence or this sentence?" Luo Fan just smiled at this time and said. His words made the Fifth Senior Brother smile bitterly and say, "I think it's the latter part. Dying of old age? That's easy." Luo Fan shook his head and laughed. As he spoke, another dimension appeared around him. This dimension instantly changed the time and space around him within a certain range, or, in other words, changed the 5th level of the Tao Master's road within a certain range. Along with this change, the Fifth Senior Brother was directly swallowed into this region. As he was swallowed into this region, his body began to produce a strange aura. It was as if he had experienced and endured the corrosion of countless years. Facing this situation, the Fifth Senior Brother smiled bitterly. "You're making a mountain out of a molehill, fellow Taoist. There's no need to use such a method to deal with me." The Fifth Senior Brother sighed and said. Hearing this, the other Tao Masters showed horror and resentment on their faces. Let go of the Fifth Senior Brother. At this time, angry roars constantly came from all directions to Luo Fan, like overwhelming waves, to completely drown him. Hearing such voices, Luo Fan just smiled faintly and said, "It seems that you're still very popular among them. They actually dare to talk to me like this for you." Hearing this, Fifth Senior Brother only smiled bitterly and said, "I only did some small things for them. In fact, I even threw the matter to them very irresponsibly, but they actually treated me like this. This makes me feel really ashamed." Saying this, there was actually a bit of gratification and joy in his expression. Although he said that, it was clear that he did not completely ignore the kindness these cultivators had shown him. Hearing this, Luo Fan just smiled and said, "I see. It seems that the Fifth Senior Brother of the 5th level has always been you. It's just that you put someone else in the light. Moreover, they are well aware of it." At this time, the Fifth Senior Brother's body had already begun to show an aura of aging, and the wrinkles on his face began to increase little by little. He looked like a young man who was running towards old age and death. Seeing the Fifth Senior Brother like this, the many Tao Master's disciples all looked at Luo Fan with eyes full of killing intent. If it weren't for the fact that they couldn't move at this time, they might have all pounced on Luo Fan and perished together. At this moment, there were cultivators who roared and constantly wanted to remind the young-looking Tao Master's disciples and the child-looking Tao Master's disciples in the dimensional chaos above. They wanted to wake them up. As long as any of them woke up and knew what was happening here, then even if they couldn't easily kill Luo Fan, it would definitely not be a problem to save the Fifth Senior Brother. However, it was a pity that although they were determined and each of them was willing to sacrifice their lives for the Fifth Senior Brother, there were some things that could not be decided by willpower. The dimensional chaos was obviously in existence that could not be decided by willpower. At this time, even if they had attached their willpower to it, even if they had used all the effort and strength they could mobilize, they simply couldn't break through the barrier of the dimensional chaos and enter the ears of the two Tao Master's disciples. At this time, they were still constantly fighting in the form of hand-to-hand combat. The physical skills and even the martial arts skills revealed in the battle were far beyond the imagination of an ordinary sixth tribulation expert. If the many Tao Master's disciples had the mind to comprehend these at this time, they would definitely be able to understand many things from the battle between the two of them. It might even allow some cultivators to make great progress in their cultivation in the process. Of course, this was just an if. Obviously, such an if did not happen. At this time, the many Tao Master's disciples could only pay attention to their own lives and the fifth senior brother's life. If his life was gone, everything else would be in vain. Therefore, at this time, even if they knew that the battle and the dimensional chaos would be of great benefit to them, enough to allow them to comprehend many incredible mysteries and obtain many unimaginable truths, they could only turn a blind eye to the battle and even try their best to interrupt it, hoping that one of the two Tao Master's disciples could wake up and get rid of the misfortune of the Tao Master's disciples. Luo Fan saw such a situation, but he was quite calm in his heart. He was not moved by their efforts at all. He just quietly looked at the person in front of him. Although there was fear in his eyes, his expression was still rather calm. It was as if he had already grasped some kind of confidence and was certain that he would not die and his Tao would disappear. "Are you stalling for time?" Luo Fan looked at the fifth senior brother, who was gradually aging, and asked curiously, "Of course, isn't it obvious? At this time, what else can I do except to stall for time?" The fifth senior brother still looked calm and said quite frankly, "Oh, you actually dare to say that? Aren't you afraid that I will directly destroy your purpose and kill you?" Luo Fan just smiled and said, "Of course not. Although you can do it, I know that you will never do it." The fifth senior brother just said, "Why?" Luo Fan clearly knew that the fifth senior brother was stalling for time and deliberately divided the sentence into several sentences, but he still asked quite cooperatively, "Because, in your eyes, I am just an ant. In fact, all of us are nothing more than ants in your eyes. You want to kill us just because you want to at this time, but it is not really necessary to kill us. For you, perhaps the two senior brothers are more important. At this time, knowing that I am stalling for time, you will cooperate with me just to see if the two senior brothers have a chance to wake up and at the same time bring some pressure to you." The fifth senior brother said with a smile. There was no uncertainty in his expression at all, as if what he said was the truth. Since he looked at Luo Fan in this way, then Luo Fan must be such a person. That absolute confidence suddenly made Luo Fan understand why the disciples of the entire fifth level of the Tao Master's path trusted him so much and wanted him to live so much. With such a strong mind and such a firm will, no matter in what world, no matter what situation he was in, he was bound to be outstanding. In the fifth level of the Tao Master's path, his existence was likely to bring an extremely bright future to the disciples of the Tao Master. Of course, at this moment, the Tao Master's disciples were in a predicament. Although it was quite sullen for them, it was obviously because of him. Because of an unavoidable factor, the Tao Master's disciples obviously did not really place their hatred on the fifth senior brother. However, think about it. If there was no Luo Fan, it would be really easy for the fifth senior brother to deal with the alliance of individual cultivators like Meng Luo and the others. In the beginning, the fifth senior brother did not even need to show up. He could just use his puppets to control them and easily get rid of all the existences in the alliance of individual cultivators. He did not need to be reduced to this situation now. Moreover, even if Luo Fan appeared here, even if Luo Fan participated in this matter, in fact, it did not mean that the fifth senior brother was completely helpless. In fact, if it were not for Luo Fan's clever means and many abilities that the disciples of the Tao Master did not know, such as the level of communication, even Luo Fan might have been killed long ago. Even so, during the process, Luo Fan almost died several times. All of this, in the final analysis, was actually the means of the fifth senior brother. From this aspect, it was enough to see how extraordinary the fifth senior brother was. It was enough to see how strong the sense of security he brought to the other disciples of the Tao Masters. I didn't expect you to know me so well in such a short time. Luo Fan just smiled slightly and said. The fifth senior brother exhaled and said, "It seems that my guess is correct. Yes, everything is correct. For me, all of you are just a bonus. My real target is them." Luo Fan just raised his hand and pointed up, aiming at the disciples of the two Fate Dao Masters who were fighting fiercely in the dimensional chaos area at this moment. "Well, then, can you let me go now so that I can find a way to remind them to quickly end their internal conflict and fight with you?" The fifth senior brother said. Hearing this, Luo Fan laughed and said, "Do you think it's possible? You don't need to answer. I know you must say it's possible. I can tell you clearly that it's impossible. Although I want to spar with them and comprehend more of the mysteries of cultivation through them, I have no choice but to fight them. But it doesn't mean that I really have no grudges against you. I really don't care that you escaped from me. To me, even though you guys are just extras, you're still rather important extras, especially after you've almost killed me twice." The fifth senior brother smiled bitterly and said, "That's a pity. Originally, I had some ways to wake them up." Luo Fan smiled and said, "Don't worry, I won't let you use them. For me, this kind of oppression is a test for them. If they can wake up before you die, then I will admit that they are strong. You can also escape because I admit that you are strong. Otherwise, all of you will die. Are we the disciples of the town master? We have so many backers. Don't you think about it?" The fifth senior brother asked very sincerely. Luo Fan just smiled and said, "Of course I don't care. At this time, I've already come this far. Do I still care about your backers? Not to mention that it's not easy for the experts of the 8 tribulations and 9 tribulations to attack. At least it's not easy for them to attack me in the 5th floor. Even if they have such means, I must get rid of all of you. As for my death, that's something that will happen after I get rid of you." Chapter 2669. All right, I can only admit that I'm at my wit's end now. After a long while, he could only sigh. At this moment, the fifth senior fellow apprentice looked like an old man in his 80s or even his 90s. His current appearance made him look incomparably old. Compared to before, there was a world of difference between the sky and the earth. That kind of face meant that his life was about to end. It must be known that for those who had transcended the limits of their lifespans, their appearance was completely dependent on their mental state. As long as their mental state did not collapse, their appearance would be their most perfect state, even if they were about to die. At least, it was the state that they wanted the most. Under such a background, fifth senior brother suddenly became so old, which was obviously a sign of his mental state collapsing. His appearance did not seem to be a reflection of his lifespan or vitality at all. His mental state collapsing obviously meant that his death was already right in front of him. Looking at fifth senior brother's appearance, Luo Fan only smiled faintly and said, "It seems that you've lost the bet. You're not as powerful as you think you are, and you can't last until their internal strife is over." Hearing this, fifth senior brother smiled bitterly and said, "Indeed, I'm really much weaker than powerhouses on the 7th level like you. I really hope that I can ascend to the 7th level too." As he spoke, his face seemed to have aged a little. He looked like a normal old man who was over 100 years old. From his expression, one could tell that although he appeared to be quite calm, as if everything was within his control, the panic and worry in his heart had not decreased at all. This was not a problem with his mental state, but the problem with the surrounding dimensions. The existence of dimensions was an intrinsic existence of heaven and earth. Ordinary existences like domains were billions of times inferior to the existence of dimensions. Domains could control space-time, cause and effect, the world, and the rules, which were all unimaginable achievements. This kind of dimensional transformation, which was even more profound and powerful by who knew how many billions of times, was naturally even more powerful. At this moment, according to Luo Fan's settings, he had to keep aging. As long as the fifth senior brother was unable to resist the effects of the dimensional changes, he could only continue to age. Even if the price of this aging is the collapse of his mentality, it is still so. In the face of such a situation, no matter how firm fifth senior brother's mental fortitude was, or how strong his mental fortitude was, he could only crumble. That was why fifth senior brother was behaving in such a manner. From this aspect, it could also be seen that although Luo Fan was watching the other party stall for time, in reality, he did not relax during the process. He did not relax his methods. He would deal with his opponent the same way he would deal with him. He didn't go easy on him just because he wanted to test the strength of a 2 Fate 7 Tribulation expert. The reason for this was naturally because of his previous comprehension. Only now did he understand that he might really die if he courted death. He understood that if he really looked down on other cultivators like before, he might really be erased by other cultivators. Under such circumstances, how could he make the same mistake again? How could he still relax when he could deal with other cultivators and not get rid of them? That was why it seemed like he was going easy on him just now, as if he was cooperating with his opponent to stall for time. But that was only what it looked like. In reality, no matter how his opponent stalled for time, it was all the same to him. If he wanted to let his opponent die of old age, he would need to waste so much time. He needed his opponent's mentality to crumble. No matter what his opponent said, no matter how he encouraged himself, no matter how he tried to entice him to speak, the result would not change. Faced with such a situation, the fifth senior brother gradually came to a realization. In reality, it was because he understood that he said he had no other choice and did not speak. Otherwise, with his level, how could he not be able to find something to say so easily? How could he admit defeat so easily? It was because he understood that no matter what he said, the situation would not change. At this moment, Luo Fan looked at fifth senior brother with even more admiration. However, this admiration was not enough for him to let him go. Therefore, at this moment, he just looked at him quietly. Can we make a choice? At this moment, a Tao Master's disciple called out. There was an indescribable determination in his voice. It was as if he was going to risk everything. What choice? Luo Fan just looked at the cultivator and asked faintly. Although he was communicating with fifth senior brother in the dimensional change, it did not mean that he had completely given up his perception of the outside world, nor had he completely given up his control over the other Tao Master's disciples. Therefore, at this moment, although the voice of the Tao Master's disciple was not loud, he still heard it clearly. Choose how to die? That Tao Master's disciple gritted his teeth and said, "Oh, it seems that you want to sacrifice yourself and think of a way to die longer. All right, I will fulfill your wish. I can give you a chance to choose how you want to die." When Luo Fan heard this, he instantly understood and could not help but laugh. Hearing this, the facial muscles of the Tao Master's disciple trembled slightly, but he still gritted his teeth and said, "I want to die after hundreds of millions of years." Hundreds of millions of years? That's not a problem at all. Although I think it will be quite painful, it's fine as long as you like it. Luo Fan just smiled faintly. Dying in hundreds of millions of years seemed to have completely achieved his goal. It would allow him to delay as much time as possible and give the Tao Master's disciples enough time to recover from the internal strife. After all, no matter how much internal strife there was, it was impossible for it to continue for hundreds of millions of years. However, it was obvious that this Tao Master's disciple had obviously underestimated Luo Fan. Hundreds of millions of years was just the time that the Tao Master's disciple could sense. But for Luo Fan, this period of time could be completely compressed into a moment. With his ability to manipulate time, this was not a problem at all. At this time, fifth senior brother did not hear this conversation at all. Although Luo Fan had the ability to let him hear, it was obvious that if he did not take the initiative to let him hear, it was impossible for him to pass through the barrier of the dimensional anomaly and hear the sounds of the outside world. If fifth senior brother heard this conversation, he would definitely stop the Tao Master's disciple immediately. He was all too clear about what kind of strength and existence that the seventh tribulation realm could possess. Even the light of heaven and earth was just a bubble in front of such an existence. Perhaps the disciple of the Tao Master thought that he had the ability to change and distort time as much as possible, so that the flow of time inside and outside was as close as possible. However, he knew that it was impossible. Even if he exploded the light of heaven and earth, absorbed all the power of the light of heaven and earth, and added it to his own time, it was impossible to go against the distortion of the seventh tribulation realm. In other words, no matter what price he paid, it was impossible to change the situation where the flow of time was compressed into a moment. In this case, for the Tao Master's disciple, what would happen next would be pure torture, and it might even cause great mental pressure to other Tao Master's disciples, without any benefit. Are you ready? Luo Fan obviously would not give fifth senior brother a chance to persuade him. At this time, he just looked at the Tao Master's disciple and said lightly. Hearing this, fifth senior brother took a deep breath and said, "Let's begin. Let me see what means you have to make me die for hundreds of millions of years." At this time, Luo Fan just smiled faintly, then raised his hand and patted the Tao Master's disciple in the void. With this pat, a mass of space-time instantly rushed towards the Tao Master's disciple. Although the Tao Master's disciple had recovered a little strength, this strength was only enough for him to speak, but he could not use his divine sense or power at all. At this time, seeing the mass of space-time rushing towards him, he could only grit his teeth and use his light of heaven and earth to block in front of him. At this moment, he felt that his light of heaven and earth and himself were directly hit by the mass of space-time, and he directly fell into a space-time that was completely different from the fifth level of the road to Tao Master. As soon as he entered this space-time, he instantly felt that the dimension he was in had undergone earth-shattering changes. Of course, as an expert of the fifth tribulation, he had actually only heard about and seen the dimension. He had no real understanding of it at all. At least, he had no understanding of this kind of manipulation of the dimension. At this time, he only felt that everything about him had lost its function. Whether it was the control of power, the control of the light of heaven and earth, or the control of his own divine sense, they had all disappeared in an instant. In a trance, he felt that he was the only one left in the universe. Except for himself, even the first wisp of power that he had condensed for billions of years had completely disappeared. In the face of this situation, an inexplicable regret emerged in his heart. "I can't resist at all." This thought emerged from the bottom of his heart, causing an inexplicable regret to appear on his face. However, it was too late for regret. At this moment, he felt that some kind of indescribable power was eroding his body. This kind of erosion was so strong and so slow. This kind of powerful erosion made it impossible for any means to stop this erosion, and it could not be stopped. But the slow erosion made this kind of erosion take a very long time to completely erode him, and then it would really kill him. Obviously, this kind of erosion was Luo Fan's killing move against him. At this time, in the outside world, the disciples of the Tao Master's disciples roared, their voices full of anger and despair. Obviously, they saw Luo Fan's torture of the Tao Master's disciple. For the Tao Master's disciple, at this time had obviously accelerated to an unimaginable level. Although to them, only a few breaths had passed, for the Tao Master's disciple, it might have been tens of thousands of years. Looking at the speed of the erosion and the state of the body being eroded by some kind of power in the space-time, the Tao Master's disciples felt the same. An indescribable fear and resentment emerged from the bottom of their hearts, and they could not wait to immediately and completely erase Luo Fan. At this time, Luo Fan turned his head to look at the Tao Master's disciples and said, "Well, do you also want to choose your own way of death? Think about it. Maybe you can find a loophole in my means. Moreover, maybe the number of means I have is limited, and before I kill some of you, I can't target the others." Hearing Luo Fan's words, the Tao Master's disciples showed even more anger on their faces. This kind of ridiculing and cruel words was really unacceptable to them, who were at the peak of the fifth level of the Tao Master's road. "Your Excellency, do you really want to be our enemy?" a Tao Master's disciple roared. Hearing this, Luo Fan sneered and said, "Do you think there is still a possibility of peace between us if I let you go now?" Even if he received an affirmative answer from the other Tao Master's disciples, he would not believe it. Now, he had completely crushed the nobility of the Tao Master's disciples into the mud. For the Tao Master's disciples, he was obviously an absolutely unforgivable existence. Even if he let them go at this time, they would probably regard him as their lifelong enemy and take killing him as their biggest goal in life. Under such circumstances, letting them go was obviously like letting a tiger return to the mountain, and he would not do such a thing. At this time, Luo Fan changed the topic and said to the Tao Master's disciples, "It seems that you still have some confidence. I'm very curious. What other trump cards do you have now?" This kind of judgment was actually not difficult to make. It should be known that the rogue cultivators had many trump cards, and they could trigger the power of the Tao Master's prison to descend at the moment of death and pull them into the Tao Master's prison. Chapter 2670. At this moment, upon hearing his words, the expressions on the faces of the Tao Master's disciples changed slightly. Of course, not every Tao Master's disciple had a change in expression. After all, although they were all Tao Master's disciples, they were still different individuals. Since they were different individuals, their minds, wills, and attitudes would be different. Since there were differences, there would naturally be differences in strength. Some Tao Master's disciples could completely ignore Luo Fan's direct questioning, but some Tao Master's disciples did not have the ability to remain calm and were unable to do so. Therefore, at this moment, there was naturally a difference in their behavior. In the face of such a situation, Luo Fan only smiled faintly and increased his vigilance. With a thought, he raised his hand and slapped towards the Tao Master's disciples. Since he knew that the other party had a trump card, he naturally had to get rid of them as soon as possible. Therefore, he naturally could not do as he had previously decided and get rid of the Tao Master's disciples one by one. At this moment, with a soft poof, the power of the Tao Master's prison was born from nothingness and directly appeared in front of Luo Fan, where the Tao Master's disciple, who had been compressed into a short period of time, was located. It directly wrapped around the Tao Master's disciple and began to tremble slightly. The dimensional structure that Luo Fan had constructed for the Tao Master's disciple was quite exquisite and mysterious. Under normal circumstances, even a sixth tribulation expert would not be able to resist such a method. However, at this moment, in the face of the power of the Tao Master's prison, his dimensional structure was as fragile as a piece of paper. Under the impact of the power of the Tao Master's prison, it had already disappeared without a trace after a slight tremble. Then, the power wrapped around the Tao Master's disciple, who only had half a head left, and returned to the Tao Master's prison with a flash, bringing along half a head. It could be said that if the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison had been a little slower, Luo Fan would have definitely been able to exhaust the Tao Sovereign's disciple to death using the method that he had suggested. As expected, he still has a trump card. At this time, a strange expression appeared on Luo Fan's face. He seemed to be a little surprised, but also a little enlightened. What was surprising was that the other party had actually managed to endure to this point before activating his trump card and drawing the power of the Tao Lord's prison to descend. However, he suddenly realized that the other party did indeed have a backup plan and was not a fish on his chopping board. In the face of such a situation, the expressions of the disciples of the Tao Masters changed dramatically. Although the disciples of the Tao Sovereign did not know each other very well, they all knew each other. They all understood what kind of existences each other was and what kind of will they had. Under such circumstances, in just a few breaths, one of the Tao Master's disciples could not bear the blow and directly revealed his trump card, or in other words, his backup plan. This was enough to show how much suffering he had suffered in the process. How terrifying! This person is even more powerful and terrifying than I imagined. Such a thought flashed across the minds of the disciples of the Tao Master's disciples. Such a thought was naturally directed at Luo Fan, who was standing in front of them at this moment. The reason why the disciple of the Tao Master ignored their agreement and revealed his trump card was obviously because of Luo Fan's coercion. To be able to force a disciple of the Tao Master's firm to such a step, Luo Fan's methods were powerful and terrifying. Just thinking about it, they knew that they would definitely not be able to bear it. With such a realization, how could they not be shocked and nervous? After all, They had already suffered an attack from Luo Fan at this time. The dimension around them had obviously fallen into the other party's control. This also meant that their fate and how they would die were completely dependent on the other party's will. In the face of such a situation, an inexplicable expression appeared on Luo Fan's face, but his eyes were filled with anticipation. He was looking forward to these disciples of the Tao Master revealing some trump cards that were beyond his expectations. Every time one of these trump cards appeared, it would greatly enhance his knowledge of cultivation, the division of the Tao Master's path, and the disciples of the Tao Master. All of these would greatly improve his understanding of cultivation, the division of the Tao Master's path, and the disciples of the Tao Master. And this improvement was enough to feed back to his own cultivation realm, enough to feed back to the predicament that he encountered at this time, which was about to come to the seventh major tribulation. Perhaps it was because of a certain knowledge that made him realize what he was missing and directly triggered the seventh catastrophe. Once the seventh catastrophe was triggered, it meant that he had a chance to improve further. At the very least, after passing through the catastrophe, his cultivation level would be greatly improved. With such a realization, how could he not expect these disciples to show some unexpected means? At this time, the disciples of the Tao Masters shone brightly. The light of heaven and earth, the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth, the perfect light of heaven and earth, erupted from their bodies and penetrated into the changing dimensions. In terms of power alone, the characteristics of the light of heaven and earth were enough to suppress the dimensional changes that Luo Fan made around them. That was to say, if it was purely based on strength, the disciples of the Tao Masters could already celebrate their victory and escape to heaven at this time. However, it was clear that the current battles did not only depend on one's strength. Otherwise, he would not have to bear the fate of almost dying several times before. After devouring the billions of replicas of the world that were born in the sixth major tribulation, the quantity of his light of heaven and earth had completely surpassed the power of the seventh tribulation experts. With this kind of mass, it would be enough to make those seventh tribulation powerhouses helpless. They could only wait for death to come. If power could really determine everything, and the intensity of power could really determine the outcome of all battles, obviously this was not the case. In front of an existence at the level of Luo Fan, power was just a prerequisite. For them, enough power to display their means was already enough. No matter how much power they had, although it was not a waste, it was not very useful in a battle. At this time, it was the same. If the light of heaven and earth that these disciples of the Tao Masters had really joined forces, the quantity was absolutely enough to completely change the dimensional structure around them by Luo Fan. If power could really determine everything, these light of heaven and earth were enough to completely break through these dimensional changes in a short period of time and directly overturn the surrounding dimensional structure. However, of course, this was not the case. Even if they only used this kind of power, which was not even a fraction of the opponents, the gap between their comprehension was real. The changes in these dimensions were completely beyond the comprehension of a fifth tribulation expert. For the fifth tribulation experts, the existence of such a dimensional existence was illusory. Perhaps they could know that there were countless dimensions in this world, and even know the various characteristics of the dimensions. However, that was only knowledge. It was impossible to change it, break it, or even control it. They did not even have the ability to change, manipulate, or even touch it. Naturally, it was even more impossible to break it. Therefore, the light of heaven and earth that they possessed at this time was far more powerful than the power that Luo Fan had added to the surrounding dimensions. However, in the end, it was like an attack on a phantom. Except for some ripples, it could not have any impact on the surrounding dimensional structure at all. Those dimensional structures still penetrated deep into their bodies and continued to penetrate deep into their bodies, causing all kinds of indescribable changes to the space-time, the power in their bodies, and even their souls. This kind of change was so direct and so mysterious. In this kind of change, at this time, the many practitioners clearly felt at this time that some kind of change had taken place in their souls. They felt that their strength and their bodies were all undergoing some kind of change. Faintly, their vitality was gradually fading, and their lives were gradually being lost. "Didn't you say that we should choose how to die?" A Tao Master's disciple shouted and shouted. "I've already given you a chance, but you didn't seize it. You didn't choose the way of death within the time I said. So, of course, you can only follow my wishes. So, it's just that you didn't seize the opportunity." Luo Fan just smiled faintly at this time and said at this time, it couldn't be more simple for him to answer this kind of question that had no lethality at all. If he wanted to come up with something that could be said to be perfect, there was no problem at all. At this time, although his answer was not perfect, it was obviously enough to make these Tao Master's disciples speechless. You didn't say that there was a time limit before. Of course, being speechless did not mean that they couldn't say something if they had to say it. At this time, a Tao Master's disciple said so. Hearing this, Luo Fan just smiled faintly and said, "I gave you a chance to choose out of kindness, not an obligation. Is there a rule that I must give you a chance to choose? I said before that you should make the best use of your time and do everything possible to choose the way of death as soon as possible. Since you didn't do this, it means that you have given up this opportunity and such a possibility. In that case, what else is there to say?" Luo Fan's words finally made the many Tao Master's disciples speechless. At this time, the dimensional change had penetrated deep into the bodies of many cultivators, directly penetrating all their things, all their existences, all their powers, and all their powers. Under this infiltration, they felt as if their bodies had become no longer their own. All their power, even the physical strength of their bodies and even the mental strength of their hearts had been completely deprived at this time. As for the light of heaven and earth, at this time, although it tried its best to prop up a defensive circle around it to protect itself, it could not have any effect on the surrounding dimensional change at all. It looked as if the dimensional change had also penetrated the light of heaven and earth, causing the light of heaven and earth to change at the same time and become a part of the dimensional change. Under this change, all the disciples of the Tao Masters felt a fear of death emerging from the bottom of their hearts. Their bodies gradually stiffened, their minds gradually became dizzy, and their vitality was being sucked away bit by bit. Their lives were disappearing bit by bit. In the face of this situation, finally, the Tao Master's disciples could not bear the torment of death. Amidst the roars, waves of unparalleled power of the Tao Master's prison began to emerge from everywhere. However, after the power of the Tao Master's prison emerged, it did not immediately move towards the cultivator who activated the power of the Tao Master's prison. Instead, it began to accumulate and gather around the cultivator, vaguely as if it was searching for something, and also as if it was locking onto something. If it was only a Tao Master's disciple who took action like this, then the power of the Tao Master's prison would not be that serious and would not be able to cause any serious consequences. However, at this time, it was obvious that it was not only a Tao Master's disciple who used this method. There were at least hundreds of millions of Tao Master's disciples here. With so many Tao Master's disciples, no matter how small the probability was, in terms of absolute numbers, it was definitely not small. At this time, there were tens of thousands of people who chose to take action like this. That was, to attract the power of the Tao Master's prison to descend. At this time, the power of the Tao Master's prison continued to accumulate in this dimensional anomaly like rain, causing all kinds of indescribable effects and interference with each other. In this interference, the power of the Tao Master's prison interweaved and changed with each other, faintly producing all kinds of resonance. The exploration and locking on to something began to spread in all directions. More and more Tao Master's disciples were enveloped by the power of the Tao Master's prison. Moreover, the power of the Tao Master's prison continued to penetrate deeper and deeper into the surrounding space-time, or in other words, the surrounding dimensional anomaly. Chapter 2671. The power of the Tao Master's prison resonated with each other and gradually penetrated into the area with the dimensional anomaly, or rather, into the dimensions that Luo Fan had modified. In this process, the area with the dimensional anomaly was under great pressure and began to tremble slightly. It was as if some kind of power had begun to penetrate into the foundation of a structure and began to disintegrate it and shake the structure itself. Under this change, the many disciples of the Tao Masters felt the pressure on their bodies begin to weaken. The feeling that they were about to die under some kind of corrosion was reduced to almost nothing at this moment. In the face of this change, the disciples of the Tao Masters all revealed looks of joy, as if they had finally grasped a chance of success in an impossible situation. In this way, it was obvious what the disciples of the Tao Masters would do next. Immediately, more and more disciples of the Tao Masters began to take action, activating the means that they had originally prepared, and began to activate the power of the Tao Masters prison to descend into this area with the dimensional anomaly in the same strange way as before. As more and more power of the Tao Masters prison descended, the power of the Tao Masters prison in this area with the dimensional anomaly became more and more intense. The resonance between the power of the Tao Masters prison also became stronger and stronger, and the penetration of the surrounding dimensions also became stronger. Finally, at a certain moment, the penetration reached its limit, and everything in this area with the dimensional anomaly had already been immersed in the power of the Tao Masters prison. During this change, the disciples of the Tao Masters prison were still undetected by the power of the Tao Masters prison. At least at this moment, not a single disciple of the Tao Masters prison was captured by the power of the Tao Masters prison, and not a single one of them disappeared from the 5th level of the Tao Masters path. It was obvious that although the disciples of the Tao Masters had gone all out, they were not completely unprepared. They still had many means to prevent themselves from perishing together with the enemy. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan frowned slightly. As expected of the disciples of the Tao Masters prison, they actually have such a deep understanding of the capture mechanism of the Tao Masters prison. Such a thought flashed across his mind. It must be said that although the means that the disciples of the Tao Masters prison were somewhat ingenious, they were not so ingenious that he could not see through them at a glance. In fact, he had already seen through how they had managed to do it when they had only displayed it earlier. However, they were able to provoke the power of the prison of Tao Master in a way that was close to the critical level. Through this provocation, they summoned the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison. After that, they used the characteristics of the critical boundary to hide their aura and essence in a place where the power of the Tao Master's purgatory could not reach. Or rather, they could hide under the boundary where the Tao Master's prison would not be able to capture them. If that was the case, the Tao Master's prison would not have captured them or suppressed them. Of course, if that was the case, the power of the Tao Master's prison would naturally dissipate after failing to find them. If that was the case, they would only get a little bit of breathing space. Obviously, it would not bring so much pressure to Luo Fan. In fact, the reason why they were able to achieve such an outcome was because the process just now was only the first step of their means. After attracting the power of the Tao Master's prison, they repeated the process again and again, provoking the power of the Tao Master's prison again and again, causing the power of the Tao Master's prison to descend again and again, and hiding within the boundary of the power of the Tao Master's prison again and again. If this continued, it would result in the current situation. The principle was, of course, relatively simple. It seemed that as long as one knew the principle, any living being could do it, even an independent cultivator. However, the truth was that the entire process was difficult. The greatest difficulty was that they could not determine the precise value of the critical level of the power of the Tao Master's prison. Given the ability of an independent cultivator, they might be able to attract the power of the Tao Master's prison to descend, but it was almost impossible to take advantage of this time to hide within the boundary of the Tao Master's prison. Even if they were lucky enough to succeed once, it would only be luck. It would be almost impossible for them to succeed the next time. It was even more impossible for them to continue the process thousands of times in an instant like the disciples of the Tao Masters. Even Luo Fan did not have the confidence to do it, let alone the other independent cultivators. It could be said that the disciples of the Tao Masters were constantly hovering on the line between life and death. If they were not careful, they would cause a great collapse, causing the power of the Tao Masters' prison to erupt and drag all of them away, completely suppressing them in the deepest part of the Tao Masters' prison. In fact, the punishment might even be more severe. The reason was simple. After all, the Tao Masters' prison was not an ordinary existence. Their actions were clearly provoking the Tao Masters' prison, and they naturally had to pay a price for such provocation. If the Tao Masters' prison really took advantage of them, what awaited them would naturally be the Tao Masters' prison's revenge. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan could only sigh in admiration. There were so many people, yet every single one of them could do it so perfectly. It was truly an incredible thing. It was also enough to prove that the disciples of the Tao Masters' prison had a deeper understanding of it than what he had previously known. So that's how it is. In this case, I only need to make some small changes, and maybe it will be enough to solve all of them. Luo Fan thought. His eyebrows slowly relaxed, and the expression on his face gradually became relaxed. The disciples of the Tao Masters were clearly playing with fire, using an extremely subtle method to maintain an extremely fragile balance. If that was the case, he only needed to push the balance slightly, and the situation would collapse in an instant. The disciples of the Tao Sovereigns would suffer the backlash of the Tao Sovereigns' prison in an instant. At that time, they would definitely be suppressed in an instant. Facing such a situation, how could Luo Fan not feel relaxed? He looked at the many disciples of the Tao Masters, and his eyes flickered slightly. He continued to explore the various changes in a deeper direction, studying the infiltration of the power of the countless Tao Masters' purgatories. After understanding the principle behind it, he could clearly see more things than before. The surging power of the Tao Masters' prison, which seemed to have no trace at all, now had countless details, including the interval between the powers of the Tao Masters' prison, the frequency of the infiltration of the power of the Tao Masters' prison, the direction of the infiltration of the power of the Tao Masters' prison, and everything else were completely revealed to him. As this was revealed, he felt that the power of the Tao Masters' prison, which seemed to be flawless before, was now filled with more and more flaws. With a slight thought, he suddenly mobilized his worldview and changed the dimension that he had given to the area. As he willed it, the dimension that had been completely infiltrated trembled slightly, and suddenly broke free from the infiltration of the power of the Tao Masters' prison. If this dimensional change came from the cultivator on the 7th level of the Tao Masters' path, the power of the Tao Masters' prison would have already discovered it and locked onto the 7th Tribulation Expert. Then, the 7th Tribulation Expert would be directly pulled into the Tao Masters' prison and completely suppressed. However, it was clear that the dimensional change did not come from the 7th Tribulation Expert on the 7th level of the Tao Masters' path. Instead, it came from Luo Fan. The power imprint and the essence of the power were all from Luo Fan. Although Luo Fan had the strength of a 7th Tribulation Expert and could even crush some weak 7th Tribulation Experts, he was still a 7th Tribulation Expert. However, he was ultimately not a true 7th Tribulation Expert. His 7th Great Tribulation was still floating above his head, ready to descend at any time. In other words, he was still only a 6th Tribulation Expert. At least, in essence, he could only be considered a 6th Tribulation Expert. In this way, whether it was in terms of level or position, he was recognized by the 5th level of the Tao Masters' path. In other words, he was recognized by the rules of the Tao Masters' prison. In other words, it was impossible for the Tao Masters' prison to pull him into the Tao Masters' prison because of his existence and what he had done in the 5th level. It was precisely because of this that the changes that Luo Fan made to the dimensional anomaly were relatively easy and smooth for the dimensional anomaly. In fact, the changes were completed without much of a reaction from the power of the Tao Masters' prison. At this moment, poof, 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 strange, soft noises kept coming out from the dimensional anomaly area. Following these soft sounds, the power of the Tao Masters' prison began to leak like a punctured balloon. The direction of the leakage was not in any other place, but in the depths of the dimensional anomaly, where the many disciples of the Tao Masters were unable to move at all. This situation was clearly a sign that the fragile balance that they had maintained had been broken in an instant. The reason for this was actually quite simple. This was because at this very moment, the power of the Tao Master's purgatory that they had triggered was acting on the dimensional anomaly that Luo Fan had constructed. Due to this situation, this area was constantly being penetrated by the power of the Tao Master's purgatory at all times. This penetration naturally had the existence of a reaction force. In other words, as the power continued to penetrate this area, the area itself and the dimension itself were also producing a subtle reaction force against the power of the Tao Master's prison. The existence of such a reaction force was naturally nothing in the past and would not have any effect on the power of the Tao Master's prison. At least, if the power of the Tao Master's prison was guided here by the dimensional anomaly, then, at this moment, the reaction force that the power of the Tao Master's prison was withstanding would definitely not cause any changes to the power of the Tao Master's prison. However, it was obvious that the power of the Tao Master's prison was not directly guided here by the dimensional anomaly. It was guided here by the many disciples of the Tao Masters who had maintained a delicate and fragile balance. Under this guidance, the reaction force was naturally brought into the fragile balance unknowingly. In other words, it was precisely because the reaction force was like this that the fragile balance existed. It truly existed here, and it truly protected the disciples of the Tao Masters from being devoured by the power of the Tao Master's prison. Obviously, what Luo Fan had done was to change the dimension. Although the change in the dimension was not too big, it was enough to change the reaction of the dimension towards the power of the Tao Master's prison. Although the change in the reaction was relatively small, it was already fatal to the fragile balance. The final result was that the fragile balance was completely broken at this moment. The breaking of the balance finally resulted in the many disciples of the Tao Masters being directly exposed to the power of the Tao Master's prison and were directly locked on by the power of the Tao Master's prison. As they were locked on, the disciples of the Tao Masters were all horrified. How is this possible? How can you still change the dimension here? The disciples of the Tao Masters exclaimed at this moment. Looking at their expressions, it was as if they had really encountered the most unbelievable change in the world. Hearing this, Luo Fan faintly sneered. At this moment, he finally understood what they were thinking. In their opinion, he was perhaps like those experts who had returned from the 7th level of the Tao Master's path against the Tao Master's path. He was essentially shameful and would not be recognized by the power of the Tao Master's prison. Once he was exposed to the power of the Tao Master's prison, what awaited him would definitely be complete suppression. Perhaps some disciples of the Tao Master's prison would know that he did not return against the Tao Master's path. However, even if he did not return against the Tao Master's path, the strength of a 7 tribulation expert was already enough to make the Tao Master's prison unable to accept him in the 5th level. If the power of the Tao Master's prison discovered the essence of his power, he would definitely be suppressed. Chapter 2672. As the balance was broken, the disciples of the Tao Masters were completely exposed to the power of the Tao Master's prison. The power of the Tao Master's prison locked onto them and invaded their bodies. It wrapped around them tightly and pulled them towards the Tao Master's prison. As this happened, their figures became more and more blurry. Vaguely, a look of despair appeared on their faces. If they had directly activated the power of the Tao Master's prison to escape their fate of death and directly entered the Tao Master's prison without any resistance, the result would not be too bad. After all, given their discretion, the method they used to activate the power of the Tao Master's prison would not be too excessive. If the method was not excessive, the punishment they would suffer after entering the Tao Master's prison would not be too excessive. At the very least, it would not reach a level that they could not bear. However, that was only the original situation. It turned out that they did not have the power to provoke the Tao Master's prison. If they provoked the power of the Tao Master's prison, they would naturally have to suffer an even more powerful blow. Therefore, if the crimes they had committed were considered one in the eyes of the Tao Master's prison, Then, after this provocation, the crimes they had committed would probably become 100, 1,000, or even 10,000. Under such a terrifying punishment, they would most likely be imprisoned forever. Perhaps even billions of years would not be enough to describe how long they would be sealed in the Tao Master's prison. In the face of such a situation, how could the disciples of the Tao Masters not feel despair? However, so what if they felt despair? At this time, they had already been truly locked onto by the power of the Tao Master's prison. They had truly become the targets of the Tao Master's prison. In such a situation, with their knowledge and experience, there was no longer any possibility for them to escape and ascend to heaven. It seems that we have really failed this time. It's a pity that we failed at the most likely moment of success. Such thoughts flashed through the minds of the disciples of the Tao Masters. Of course, the expression might be different, but the specific meaning was the same. It should be the same as this sentence. In the face of such a situation, Luo Fan looked rather calm at this time. It could be said that the disciples of the Tao Masters were the ones who were really at a disadvantage. In other words, it was their own choices that caused their subsequent fate. If they did not intend to use the power of the Tao Master's prison to plot against Luo Fan, then what awaited them would at most be the same as the other Tao Masters, or rather, the same as the other individual cultivators, directly sealed by the power of the Tao Master's prison. Although it was something that ordinary cultivators would not be able to endure, there was still a sliver of hope. It was a tiny bit of hope to get out, a tiny bit of hope to continue on his path of cultivation. It was precisely because they wanted to scheme against him that they chose such a method to provoke the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison, and also cause the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison to retaliate against them. It could be said that they were reaping what they had sown. At this moment, the battle between the youthful-looking Seven Tribulation expert and the child-looking Seven Tribulation expert had reached its peak in the region with the chaotic dimensional structure. In the hearts of the two of them, they had already forgotten everything in the outside world. All that was left was each other. In other words, all that was left was the power and technique that both of them had displayed. In every instant, they would exchange their techniques hundreds of millions of times. Every exchange represented the pinnacle of the battle of flesh and blood. It represented the pinnacle level that any living being who regarded the flesh and blood as the goal of cultivation could only dream of. Due to the dimensional chaos, they could not display any extraordinary abilities that could leave their bodies. Any extraordinary abilities could not be used in the surroundings, nor could they truly change the surrounding environment. However, at this moment, the situation in the region around them was many times more chaotic than before. This was naturally not because the dimensional chaos region had a tendency to converge towards them. Instead, it was because in the process of battle, although they were only using the power of their flesh and blood, the various fluctuations, auras, and powers that were revealed during the process had already stirred up the surrounding environment and even vaguely affected the surrounding dimensions. If it were not for the dimensional chaos, all these changes would have been enough to give birth to countless worlds and evolve countless unbelievable divine abilities to achieve such an effect. It would even be enough for ordinary living beings to comprehend the inconceivable principles of cultivation the moment they saw this scene and then soar into the sky. However, at this moment, in this dimensional chaos region, all these changes only cause the surrounding dimensions to become even more chaotic. As a result, the closer they were to them, the more blurry and difficult it was to identify the scene. Similarly, since it was difficult for outsiders to identify them, it was naturally even more difficult for them to identify the situation in the outside world. In fact, the real reason why they were so engrossed in this battle and focused their attention on each other was partly because of the unimaginable dimensional chaos around them at this moment. Because the dimensional chaos was simply too severe and the isolation from the outside world was too strong, it was as if they were completely separated from the outside world. It was as if they were the only ones left in the universe. And this feeling grew deeper and stronger in this battle, ultimately resulting in this outcome. That young-looking Seven Tribulation expert was truly enraged. Or rather, he was interested in the fight. However, the childlike seventh tribulation powerhouse was different. To the childlike seventh tribulation powerhouse, he was just instinctively venting the various negative emotions brought about by his resurrection. At this moment, as the battle progressed, the young-looking seventh tribulation powerhouse might become more and more engrossed and pay less and less attention to the outside world and the current situation of the Tao Master's disciples. However, this was not the case for the childlike seventh tribulation powerhouse. As the battle became more and more intense, he vented more and more of his negative emotions. In the end, the result was that his perception of the situation in the outside world became clearer, and his mind also became clearer. In every instant, they exchanged billions of blows. The result of this was that in every instant, this childlike seventh tribulation expert vented his negative emotions billions of times. In this way, the rate at which the negative emotions weakened was naturally faster than one could imagine. Of course, this speed naturally depended on the base number. If it was an ordinary living being, the accumulated negative emotions would only need an instant to completely vent them, causing them to become unprecedentedly clear or even unimaginably clear. However, for this childlike seven tribulation powerhouse, the situation was completely different. His death just now was not just a simple death. Even if it was, he did not actually die, his Tao vanishing and his soul dispersing. However, in order to bring such great power, in order to attract that incredible power, in order to bring such great danger to Luo Fan, the price he paid was the destruction of his own soul. In this way, he'd simply tried all the possible methods of depravity during his death just now, and he'd even sunk himself to a level that ordinary cultivators couldn't even imagine. Under such circumstances, the young man, who was only a seven tribulation expert, was able to pull him back through some means, forcibly freeing him from the fate of death and allowing him to return from the unknown. That was indeed an incredible thing. However, the negative emotions accumulated in his soul were a problem that he could not do anything about. It was easy to imagine how terrifying the negative emotions that reached an extremely deep level of depravity might be. The fact that this childlike seventh tribulation powerhouse could still instinctively choose this battle method to vent his negative emotions showed that his Tao heart was extremely firm. It was naturally impossible for him to easily vent his emotions. In terms of quantity, the amount of negative emotions that would cause an ordinary cultivator to sink into was one. Then, the amount of negative emotions that this child had gathered in the body of a seventh tribulation powerhouse would probably be calculated in the trillions at the moment of resurrection. In this way, even if he could vent his emotions billions of times in an instant, in the end he still sank into depravity and did not wake up. However, it was ultimately a limited amount of negative emotions. As he continued to vent, the negative emotions began to decrease. As the negative emotions decreased, the childlike seventh tribulation powerhouse naturally began to wake up. Naturally, he began to understand how bad the situation he was in now, and also understood how bad the situation of the disciples of the Taoist master was in. I can't go on like this. If this goes on, all my junior brothers and junior sisters may die, and their souls will scatter. At this time, this was the thought that appeared in the mind of the Tao Master's disciple. Compared to the young-like Tao Master's disciple whose eyes were already red and should have been absolutely sober, the seven tribulation powerhouse who was controlled by his instincts actually thought of his junior brothers and junior sisters, as well as his many companions who were also disciples of the Tao Master. In the face of such a situation, there was only helplessness in his heart. Now, it was already he who was powerless to resist the attack of his senior brother. Senior brother, wake up. This is not the time to fight. In the end, he finally controlled his body and his power. He let out such a loud roar and sent himself towards the young-like seventh tribulation powerhouse. It was a pity that the surrounding dimension was too chaotic. This degree of chaos not only completely cut off the sound, light, and shadow transmitted from the outside world, but also completely cut off his voice. Although it was not to the extent of completely cutting off the light and shadow, it was already quite fatal. Therefore, at this time, his loud roar did not cause any response from the other party. The young, seven tribulation powerhouse did not care about him and just launched attacks at him. His power became stronger, and the way he used it became more violent. He faintly regarded him as an irreconcilable enemy. An indescribable pleasure was released from his means, so that the childlike seven tribulation powerhouse clearly knew what kind of mentality the other party was using to fight him, and also understood how difficult it was to wake him up now. It is 10 times, or even 100 times more difficult to make a person who feels pleasure stop doing something that pleases him than to make a person who feels pain stop doing something that causes him pain. At this time, the battle that the young, seven tribulation powerhouse was fighting was the kind of battle that made him feel pleasure and joy. In such a situation, there was no absolute way to make him stop. There were no words that could make him absolutely believe them, so it was impossible to do so. But at this moment, in this place, the words were cut off. What should I do? What should I do? At this time, the childlike seven tribulation powerhouse hated himself for falling into depravity. He was very clear that the disciples of the Tao Master were simply sending their lives to the butcher's knife. Although he could not clearly grasp the state of the disciples of the Tao Master outside at this time, he could guess. He clearly knew that if the other party at this time, as long as there was one existence among those individual cultivators who could exert their strength, all the disciples of the Tao Master would have to activate the power of the Tao Master's prison and directly hide in the Tao Master's prison to escape. However, if that was the case, the result would be absolutely unacceptable to him. All kinds of thoughts flashed through his mind, and finally, the childlike seven tribulation powerhouse made his own decision. He decided not to resist the opponent's attack anymore. Only when he stopped resisting the opponent's attack could the young, seven tribulation powerhouse wake up from the excitement and really listen to what he said. Only under such circumstances would he have a chance of persuading him. However, in this case, he would have to risk his life again and bear the possibility of his body and Tao vanishing and the possibility of his soul dispersing. For the childlike seventh tribulation powerhouse who had done this several times, there was no doubt at all that he would make such a decision, or rather, there was no need to hesitate at all. Chapter 2673. At this moment, the young-looking seven tribulation expert instinctively saw a flaw. He raised his hand and threw a punch at the childlike seventh tribulation expert. This punch condensed almost all the power in his body. As it flew over, an unknown amount of space-time appeared out of thin air around the fist. It was as if he had forcibly compressed an unknown amount of space-time into the fist, refining all the power within to strengthen the fist's might. This punch transcended time, transcended cause and effect, transcended concepts, and transcended reality and illusion. At the same time, the childlike seven tribulation expert felt that his body had already started to disintegrate and collapse to a certain level. Awesome! A furious roar burst out from the mouth of the young-looking seventh tribulation expert. Immediately after, the fist forcefully imprinted itself on the body of the childlike seventh tribulation expert. Infinite power erupted. The childlike seven tribulation powerhouse couldn't withstand this impact at all at this moment. His entire body exploded with a loud bang, even turning into an even finer appearance than before he was condensed and materialized. As his body was blasted apart, the dimensional structure that had become chaotic because of his existence began to be quickly smoothed out. Of course, no matter how fast it was, there was still a period of time. After all, the dimensional chaos wasn't purely because of the childlike seven tribulation expert. That kind of chaos was caused by the conflict between the childlike seven tribulation expert and the young seventh tribulation expert regarding the changes to the dimension. Because it was caused by the conflict, the disappearance of one party could cause the conflict to disappear. Naturally, it could also cause the dimensional chaos to dissipate, allowing the dimension to restore order. However, it was also precisely because the original chaos was due to the conflict that after one party disappeared, the other party still needed time to adapt to the disappearance and recover from the state of conflict. As a result, at this moment, Even if the childlike seventh tribulation powerhouse disappeared, it would still take some time for the dimension to recover. At this moment, because of the disappearance of the enemy, the young-looking seventh tribulation expert gradually woke up from the control of his battle instincts. As he sobered up, his expression began to change. A look of regret, helplessness, and pain appeared on his face. But very soon, he sensed the changes in the outside world. He discovered the reason why the childlike seven tribulation expert had made this decision to stop resisting. "So you're not dead yet. I'm definitely going to kill you." His face darkened as he roared out. Along with such a roar, his figure flashed and broke through the changing dimensions. In a flash, he arrived at Luo Fan's location and slammed into the dimensional structure that Luo Fan had changed. Along with this change, he also began to change the dimension. Amidst these changes, the already stable structure that Luo Fan had changed began to rapidly disintegrate, and all kinds of indescribable chaos appeared in the region with the abnormal dimensional structure. "You finally woke up." At this time, Luo Fan smiled faintly and turned around. "It's just that you seem to be a little late." Then, he turned around and said with a strange expression on his face. Hearing this, the young-looking seventh tribulation expert's expression became even more unsightly. "You deserve to die." His words seemed to be spat out from the depths of hell. It was so cold that it could even freeze any living creature. Because at this moment, there were originally hundreds of millions of Tao Master's disciples in this dimensional anomaly, but now there were only a few tens of thousands of people left. All the disciples of the other Tao sovereigns had already been dragged into the Tao sovereign prison and were completely sealed by it. Even the remaining tens of thousands of Tao Master's disciples were in an extremely bad state at this time. The power of the Tao Master's prison was still wrapping around them and was still trying its best to pull them into the Tao Master's prison. If he didn't take any action, perhaps these Tao Master's disciples would also disappear in front of him. Seeing this scene, how could the young-looking seven tribulation expert not be angry? How could he not hate Luo Fan to the bone? For those fifth tribulation experts, the backlash from the Tao Master's prison was something they were powerless to resist, and could not even think of any way to resist it. However, for a seven tribulation expert, the backlash from the power of the Tao Master's purgatory was just a small matter. At this moment, the young-looking seven tribulation expert had already taken action. He began to change the surrounding dimensions. This kind of change could not produce the desired effect at this time. It only caused the surrounding dimensional anomaly to become even more chaotic. And this kind of chaos was obviously also chaos to the power of the Tao Master's prison. Under this kind of chaos, the power of the Tao Master's prison was cut off for a moment under some kind of subtle effect. This moment would not have any effect on an independent cultivator, because an independent cultivator's understanding of the Tao Master's prison was too shallow. However, for a Tao Master's disciple, this moment was enough. Given their understanding of the Tao Master's prison, this moment was enough for them to do many things. In this instant, countless Tao Master's disciples instantly changed their auras, changed their power in some kind of indescribable and subtle way, and even changed their life essence. This kind of change was not strong, but it was enough to cause a trace of hesitation in the power of the Tao Master's prison. And this hesitation continued to expand as they moved. In the end, after a few breaths, the Tao Master's disciples had completely disappeared from the power of the Tao Master's prison. In other words, they no longer existed in the eyes of the power of the Tao Master's prison. The power of the Tao Master's prison tried its best to lock onto them, but in the end, it could only sweep through the dimensional anomaly a few times before completely disappearing without a trace. It's really an ingenious method. It can actually play a role in this dimensional conflict. Luo Fan couldn't help but exclaim. Next, there will be even more ingenious changes. The young-looking Tao Master's disciple said indifferently at this moment. With this sentence, Luo Fan felt a dimensional structure that was independent of the dimensional anomaly appear around the body of the young-looking Tao Master's disciple out of thin air. Then, the tens of thousands of Tao Master's disciples were all sucked into it, completely out of Luo Fan's control. It was obvious that the Tao Master's disciple had displayed an independent space-time dimension to isolate himself from the changes to the surrounding space-time dimension. In other words, it could be said that the young-looking Seven Tribulation expert had displayed his magic treasure that was equipped with a stable dimensional structure. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan naturally knew how to deal with it. With a slight thought, his worldview of laws was instantly revealed, and with the help of the light of heaven and earth, it directly turned into a palm and pounced towards the young-looking Tao Master's disciple. This palm was a combination of the worldview of laws and the light of heaven and earth, but it was already comparable to the existence of a Seventh Tribulation expert's magic treasure. At least, in terms of dimensional structure, it was comparable to the existence of a Seventh Tribulation expert's magic treasure that contained a stable dimensional structure. Such an existence was not affected by the dimensional chaos at all. At least, the surrounding dimensional chaos could not invade the stable dimensional structure inside the palm at all. As a result, the palm speed wasn't affected by the surrounding dimensional chaos at all. In a flash, it had already crossed who knows how many obstructions and arrived beside the young-looking Seven Tribulation expert. It ruthlessly slammed down towards him. Under such a slap, the Seven Tribulation expert felt that his gauze-like magic treasure had suffered an unimaginable impact. As Luo Fan had guessed, the dimensional structure inside his magic treasure was an extremely stable dimensional structure. It also seemed to be an extremely balanced dimensional structure in the normal world. This dimensional structure, in essence, was quite similar to the dimensional structure created by Luo Fan's worldview of laws. In fact, there was no difference between the various appearances at all. Under such circumstances, the conflict between the two was not as huge as imagined. The dimensional structure of the palm directly came into contact with the dimensional structure inside the gauze. The two looked like they were glued together. Of course, the similarities on the surface were ultimately just superficial. In the end, there were still too many differences between them. The dimensional structure created by Luo Fan's worldview of laws was ultimately based on the worldview of laws. There was still a huge difference between the dimensional structure inside the gauze, which was based on the dimensional structure of the outside world, or rather, based on the worldview followed by the outside world. This difference made it impossible for the two to fuse on a deeper level. If this impossible fusion were to start now, it would naturally cause a huge conflict. Furthermore, that conflict was much greater than what the average Seven Tribulation expert had imagined. Originally, according to the combat experience of the Seven Tribulation expert, the battle between cultivators who had mastered a stable dimensional structure was generally to look for the flaws in the other party's structure and find the imperfections in the other party's structure. Normally speaking, this was a long-term process. It might take thousands of years, or even tens of thousands of years before it could be found. Of course, no cultivator could be perfect, and no cultivator's means could be flawless. Even if they completely constructed the dimensional structure inside their magic weapon according to the dimensional structure of the outside world, and used the template of the outside world to construct their own magic weapon, it was also impossible to perfectly transfer the entire outside world into their own magic weapon. In this way, they naturally had to make a choice in the process of transfer. And this choice was the source of the flaw. The thing that was abandoned was the flaw. As long as this flaw was found, the battle could obviously end in an instant. This was also a normal way of fighting between Seven Tribulation experts. At least, it was a way of fighting between Seven Tribulation experts who had mastered the dimensional structure changes. When facing Luo Fan, he obviously planned to fight with Luo Fan with the same mentality. After all, the means that Luo Fan showed at this time were too similar to the enemies he had encountered on the 7th level of the road to Tao Master. However, he did not expect that Luo Fan was not an ordinary Seven Tribulation expert at all. He was a Seven Tribulation expert who had not gone through the 7th level of the road of Tao Master, nor had he received any inheritance or gained anything from there. For him, all the means he had now about the dimensional dimension were based on his experience in battles and his own comprehension of cultivation. For him, all the rules and all the experience were obviously just nonsense. On the other hand, he was fighting in accordance with his own understanding of the dimensional structure of the battle. That was to say, a violent collision. At this time, he directly urged the palm, formed by the combination of the world view and the light of heaven and earth. Infinite power was released from the palm and exploded in an instant. In this explosion, infinite terrifying power broke out and was released fiercely towards the gauze-like magic weapon. The collision between the dimensions was revealed in the most violent way. Boom, 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 boom. Incredible roars broke out continuously at this moment, and the terrifying impact directly swept through the chaotic dimensional area. The young-looking Seven Tribulation expert was even more dumbfounded, and his whole face stiffened. The palm forcibly broke through the gauze-like magic weapon, and the dimensional structure inside it and the dimensional structure inside the gauze-like magic weapon constantly crushed each other. Under this crushing, the dimensional structure of each other collapsed at an unimaginable speed. The impact produced by the collapse of the dimension constantly leaked out from the gauze-like magic treasure and joined the ripples that were constantly sweeping in all directions, causing the ripples to become more powerful, more terrifying, and more unimaginable. Chapter 2674. How many magic treasures do you have to consume? This was the doubt that popped up in the mind of the young Seventh Tribulation powerhouse. If every battle between Seven Tribulation powerhouses broke out in this way, then it was obvious that every battle would consume a Seventh Tribulation powerhouse's magic treasure. How much energy and time would it take to successfully refine a Seventh Tribulation powerhouse's magic treasure? Based on the experience of the young Tao Master, it would take at least 300 billion years. Putting aside the amount of energy consumed, just the 300 billion years alone was not a small amount. Even the disciples of the Tao Master didn't have much time to consume, and this was only the time consumed to refine this magic treasure in the fastest way. If one's methods were a bit lacking and the method they chose wasn't perfect, then this refinement process would have to be repeated over and over again. Perhaps if one's luck was bad, they wouldn't necessarily be able to refine a Seventh Tribulation level pseudo primordial origin spirit treasure even after spending billions of trillion years. Under such circumstances, even the richest person would not be able to afford to abandon such a magic treasure in the middle of a battle and cripple it. Such a method could be said to be like an ordinary person who spent decades carving a perfect city model and finally used this model as a stone to smash a walnut. This was definitely a reckless waste of natural resources, and it was definitely a method that only a madman would choose. Obviously, at this time, in the eyes of the young Seven Tribulation powerhouse, Luo Fan's choice was directly using the city model that he had spent decades carving to carve as a stone to smash a walnut. Or rather, using it as a stone to smash people. How could he not feel puzzled by such a method? How could he not feel his anger rising from the bottom of his heart? If you want to be a stone, you do it yourself. Why do you drag me down with you? If you think this thing is useless, you can throw it away yourself. My magic treasure is incomparably precious, and I don't have the confidence to waste it like you do. However, his words obviously had no effect at all. For him, this complete dimensional structure could only exist in magic treasures and could only be carried by magic treasures. However, for Luo Fan, the dimensional structure only required him to measure his own worldview. At most, he would add his own light of heaven and earth. Even if such an existence collapsed, it would at most cause his mind to suffer a little shock. He only needed an instant to completely recover, and he would be able to use this technique again. In this way, he obviously had the confidence to smash this dimensional structure like a stone. At this time, in the face of the young Seven Tribulation powerhouse's questioning, Luo Fan just smiled faintly and said, "This is my fighting style. If you don't like it, you can admit defeat." These words made the young Seventh Tribulation powerhouse feel an indescribable anger at this time. He only felt that his body was almost bursting from his anger. "Very well, then let me see the source of your confidence," he roared. The gauze-like magic treasure suddenly shook at this moment, and the dimensional structure within it began to expand wildly in all directions. In other words, it blasted towards the palm that contained the stable dimensional structure that Luo Fan sent out. Under such a blast, the palm itself began to collapse rapidly. At the same time, the stable dimensional structure inside the gauze-like magic treasure also began to collapse continuously. Luo Fan looked at his palm that was constantly collapsing, and a look of realization appeared in his eyes. Sure enough, the dimensional structure constructed based on the worldview of laws is ultimately not comparable to the dimensional structure constructed based on the outside world. This was actually one of the reasons why he chose such a violent and head-on method to deal with the enemy. In fact, it could even be said to be the most important reason. Was Luo Fan really unable to deduce how a cultivator at the 7th tribulation level fought? Did he really not understand how their stable dimensional structure was used at all? Of course, this was impossible. How could he, who could deduce the dimensional method of fighting with just a few glances, not be able to deduce this? The reason why he had to use such a violent and head-on method of fighting, even though he could deduce this, was because he did not have the combat experience of meticulous fighting, and it was difficult for him to find the flaws in the dimensional structure like a real 7th tribulation powerhouse from the 7th level of the Tao Master's path. More importantly, he did not have much confidence in the dimensional structure that originated from the worldview of laws. This was not because he lacked confidence, but because he knew his own limits. His worldview of laws was naturally much stronger than the various concepts that ordinary cultivators below the true divine level could sort out. At least he had formed a worldview, but for the cultivators on the righteous path, it was impossible for them to obtain a complete worldview before they truly became true divine. However, this was only for those who were below the true divine level. For a true divine, his worldview of laws was obviously completely insufficient. If his worldview of laws could be comparable to the worldview of a true divine level, then he would not just be a 6th tribulation powerhouse who was comparable to a 7th tribulation powerhouse. He would have become a true divine long ago. Since his worldview of laws could not be comparable to the worldview of a true divine level, it was obvious that his worldview of laws could not be comparable to the worldview contained in the normal perfect world outside, or the worldview contained in the grand heaven and earth. After all, the perfect world and the grand heaven and earth came from a true divine. They were constructed by a true divine by consuming his own power and in various ways. Even if the worldview contained in them was not the same as the true divine's own worldview, it was bound to be of the same level. In this way, it was natural to know that the dimensional structure constructed using the dimensional structure of the perfect world and the grand heaven and earth as a template was obviously not inferior to the dimensional structure constructed by Luo Fan with his own worldview of laws. Of course, this was a normal situation. If the cultivator who constructed it was too inferior, and the originally perfect template was simulated crudely and full of flaws, then there was naturally nothing much to say. Obviously, no matter how arrogant Luo Fan was, it was impossible for him to think that every opponent he had encountered was such an existence. They were all the kind of existence that was built on a perfect template, but was extremely crude. In other words, he knew that the vast majority of the opponents he encountered were much stronger than the dimensional structure constructed by his worldview of laws in terms of attainments in this kind of dimensional structure. With this understanding, how could he not understand that there would definitely be more flaws in his dimensional structure compared to the dimensional structure constructed by other 7 tribulation powerhouses? If they were to look for flaws, even if Luo Fan was much stronger than the other party, even if his ability to find flaws was much stronger than the other party. However, because he had too many flaws, it was more likely that he would be the one to fail in the end. After understanding this, unless Luo Fan was a fool, there was no way he would do this. Therefore, what he could do was obviously to play to his strengths and avoid his weaknesses. He took advantage of the fact that the damage caused by the loss of his dimensional structure was not great, and suppressed the fact that his dimensional structure had flaws to the limit. He chose to use this method of colliding with the other party's magic treasure in such a rough way to deal with the enemy. Obviously, his previous experiences told him that this method was feasible. For example, the childlike Seven Tribulation powerhouse was eventually killed because he chose this method. And this young-looking Seven Tribulation powerhouse in front of him was also about to be defeated by this method. Of course, the dimensional structure developed by Luo Fan's worldview was much worse than the dimensional structure contained in the magic treasure after all. At this time, in the collision, the one who was really at a disadvantage was obviously Luo Fan's palm. In the collision, the speed at which the palm collapsed was much faster than the opposite side. When the dimensional structure inside the magic treasure was only half destroyed, nearly 90% of the dimensional structure developed by Luo Fan's worldview had already been destroyed. If this was the case, then what awaited Luo Fan next was the possibility of failure. After all, even if his magic treasure was destroyed, the young-looking Seven Tribulation powerhouse would at most lose a magic treasure. He would still be unscathed after all. The other party's true strength could still be displayed in the end. Luo Fan, on the other hand, would inevitably be slightly affected during this process of destruction. For the young-looking Seventh Tribulation powerhouse, this slight influence was obviously enough for him to grasp. In other words, at that time, it might be Luo Fan's time of death. Of course, for this result, the young-looking Seventh Tribulation powerhouse also paid a huge price. He had spent 300 billion years to refine this magic treasure, but he could only refine it again. However, if he were to encounter an enemy before he could successfully refine this magic treasure, then the possibility of him failing would be infinitely greater. However, at least this time he would succeed. At this moment, a ruthless look appeared in the eyes of the young-looking Seventh Tribulation powerhouse. He didn't see what this palm represented a Luo Fan, nor did he know what impact the destruction of this palm would have on Luo Fan. However, he knew that if the Earth Palm was destroyed, the dimensional structure within his magic treasure would still remain. In that case, he would still be able to use the dimensional structure within the magic treasure to unleash some powerful might. This powerful power was enough to easily get rid of Luo Fan at this time, in this dimensional chaotic region. At this moment, an indescribable resentment surged in his heart, but also an indescribable excitement. Soon, I will let you taste how big a sin it is to destroy my magic treasure. This was the thought that emerged in the mind of the young-looking Tao Master. At this time, he had completely left aside the disciples of the Tao Masters protected in his magic treasure. This young-looking Seven Tribulation powerhouse was the kind of person who was extremely prone to killing intent. If it weren't for this, the battle between him and the childlike Seven Tribulation powerhouse wouldn't have fallen to such a point, forcing the childlike Seven Tribulation powerhouse to sacrifice himself to wake him up. At this time, the attitude that Luo Fan showed that he would rather die together with the childlike Seven Tribulation powerhouse than let him suffer a loss had made him once again filled with killing intent. He had completely forgotten about the disciples of the Tao Masters who were guarding his magic treasure. At this time, the disciples of the Tao Masters felt as if they had become duckweed or fallen leaves, drifting with the waves in the storm on the sea. They couldn't control themselves at all. They even lost the concept of everything in the outside world. What the hell is going on? Is that person really so powerful that even senior brother can't deal with him? This was the thought that appeared in the minds of the disciples of the Tao Masters. At this moment, they didn't know what was going on. They didn't know that it was because their senior brother had completely forgotten about them and didn't help to calm the various shocks in the place where they were, causing them to be in a precarious situation and unable to control themselves. They just thought that it was because their senior brother couldn't protect them at all and that the battle was too fierce at this time. It was precisely because of this that they had such thoughts in their hearts. This kind of thinking made their mood fluctuate, and it was difficult for them to calm down for a while. In fact, he was already mentally prepared to die. After all, in such a fierce battle, they didn't believe that their senior brother could definitely win. Neither Luo Fan nor the Seven Tribulation powerhouse cared about what was happening inside, so naturally they didn't know. At this time, an inexplicable expression appeared on Luo Fan's face. Then, with a soft shout, he raised his hand and patted the air in front of him. With this pat, his worldview of the world appeared once again and was once again loaded by the light of heaven and earth. With the blessing of the light of heaven and earth, it turned into a stable dimensional structure in the shape of a palm. The stable dimensional structure pounced towards the young man who looked like a seventh tribulation powerhouse in front of him. Chapter 2675. The young man, who was a seventh tribulation powerhouse, felt that even if Luo Fan's technique was not a seventh tribulation powerhouse's magic treasure, it must be something similar to a magic treasure. It must take a lot of time, even hundreds of billions of years, or even trillions of years to obtain even one of them. If such a thing was used, there would obviously be one less. Even if he was a Tao Master's disciple, it was impossible for him to take it out and squander it. It was precisely because of this that he had never considered that Luo Fan would casually take out such an existence, let alone make any preparations for this possibility. However, everything that Luo Fan did in front of him had obviously subverted his previous views. This kind of means that could force a magic treasure of the Seven Tribulation Powerhouse to almost lose its dimensional structure was actually not something rare. The other party could actually casually take out one after another. This was simply equivalent to a person working hard for decades to earn hundreds of millions. But he didn't expect that for another person. These hundreds of millions were actually just pocket money that he could take out every day. One could imagine how *king this feeling was. How could the young man, a seventh tribulation powerhouse, remain calm? If he was playing a game, he would probably shout, "You're using cheats too much." At this time, it was naturally impossible for Luo Fan to change his rhythm because of the change in the mentality of this young seventh tribulation powerhouse. At this moment, the palm that he launched, or rather, the worldview that had transformed into a palm, had already rushed directly to the original palm that was about to be annihilated. It completely integrated into the palm, followed the original palm's momentum, and fiercely smashed into the gauze-like magic treasure, violently colliding with the stable dimensional structure inside the magic treasure. Faced with such a situation, the young man's face turned pale. Then his whole body rumbled, as if some kind of terrifying power was compressed into his body and then detonated crazily. This appearance, it really looked as tragic as one could imagine. Faced with such a situation, the young man couldn't help but show a look of despair in his eyes. This kind of despair suppressed the ruthlessness and anger from before. It pulled his mind back to its original state of clarity. As he regained his sobriety, he noticed the remaining tens of thousands of Tao Masters in his magic treasure again. At this moment, with a thought in his mind, the magic treasure naturally produced a kind of miraculous power, directly enveloping the tens of thousands of Tao Masters' disciples and completely freezing their bodies, which seemed to be on the verge of collapsing along with the collapse of the dimensional structure. Along with this change, the disciples of the Tao Masters instantly felt their bodies lighten. In a trance, they felt as if everything had returned to normal. The battle that could threaten them and make all the disciples of the Tao Master on the fifth layer of the Tao Master's path disappear had completely stopped. Immediately after, they felt a powerful force bring them out of the artifact in a flash. Following that, he felt a terrifying force pushing him out of the dimensional chaos zone. At this moment, endless and terrifying pressure acted on the disciples of the Tao Masters. In the face of such a situation, even the most ignorant disciples of the Tao Masters understood what was going on. How is it possible that senior brother can't deal with that person? This was what the disciples of the Tao Masters thought. For these disciples of the Tao Masters, they could see at a glance that the reason why the Seven Tribulation expert did this and sent them out of his stable dimensional structure was that he was no longer able to protect them. Because he was unable to protect them, he could only take the risk of sending them out, so that they could cross the dimensional chaos zone with their own strength and leave this battlefield. In the face of such a situation, these disciples of the Tao Masters felt admiration and gratitude for their senior brother, but at the same time, they were also shocked by the strength of Luo Fan. It should be known that Luo Fan's target at this time was an existence that was not weak among the seven tribulation experts. Such an existence, entering the fifth floor of the Road of Tao Master, was already considered to have exceeded the limit of the fifth floor of the Road of Tao Master. He was taking a great risk. Under such circumstances, the rogue cultivator, the existence that they completely disliked, was actually able to fight on par with such an expert. It seemed that they were actually evenly matched. How could these disciples of the Tao Masters accept this? For a moment, many of the disciples of the Tao Masters felt panic in their hearts. At this time, they did not know what they should do next. They could not imagine what they would face if their senior brother failed, and what they should do to prevent such a change. Naturally, Luo Fan saw the departure of these disciples of the Tao Masters. However, he did not care as he watched them leave. The reason for this was actually very simple, because, in his eyes, these disciples of the Tao Masters were completely like ants. Because they were ants, no matter how many there were, it did not matter to him at all. In this way, even if these disciples of the Tao Masters left this battlefield and got out of his control, it would only be temporary. As long as he could win the battle against this young-like seven tribulation expert, then it would be impossible for the disciples of the Tao Masters to escape. And once he failed in this kind of battle, obviously there would be no other way. In this case, naturally, there was no need to worry about them leaving. It was precisely because there was no need to worry about them no matter what, that at this time, Luo Fan completely ignored them and let them leave. In the face of such a situation, the young-like seven tribulation expert breathed a sigh of relief. While he heaved a sigh of relief, his attacks grew stronger and stronger. He constantly stirred up his magic weapon, stirring up this good news. The dimensional structure that had become broken inside the magic weapon, which was like a gauze, fiercely, without reservation, collided with the palm that Luo Fan had just restored. Such a collision, the effect was naturally quite shocking. The internal dimensional structure of this magic weapon was undoubtedly greatly damaged. But at the same time, even greater damage directly appeared on the palm that Luo Fan had sent out. Moreover, compared to the damage suffered inside the magic weapon, the damage suffered by this palm was even stronger and more terrifying. However, for Luo Fan, this was just a matter of adding one more palm to his palm. Therefore, he was not moved at all, and did not even feel a trace of heartache because of this change. On the contrary, it was the young-like seven tribulation expert who seemed to have the upper hand who was heartbroken, as if he had made the most unforgivable mistake. After all, compared to Luo Fan's illusory palm, which could be condensed at any time, his magic treasure had been refined for hundreds of billions of years before it could be successfully condensed. After such a long period of time, the refined object and the method that could be created and born at any time were mutually annihilated, perishing together. Even if the other party suffered more losses, it was still not worth it. He clearly knew this, but he had no choice but to take such action because of the situation. How could this young-looking seventh tribulation powerhouse not feel helpless? How could he feel any joy? In the face of such a situation, Luo Fan's expression was rather calm. Soon, another palm penetrated through the layers of barriers and directly fused with the palm he had sent out before, once again restoring the dimensional structure that had been lost due to the collision. And so on, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. In the end, after hundreds of clashes and hundreds of integration with the dimensional structure formed by the worldview, the outcome of the battle was finally revealed. It was a gauze-like Dharma treasure. Although it looked rather ordinary, it could not be considered a Dharma treasure at all. However, compared to the sword-like magic treasure in the hands of the childlike seventh tribulation expert, it was clearly many times stronger. Back then, the childlike seventh tribulation expert also used the dimensional structure inside the magic treasure to fight against the enemy. What he encountered was also the brutal method that Luo Fan used, using the dimensional structure to fight head-on. However, the final result was that the sword-like magic treasure could not even withstand the first collision. It directly perished together with the palm that Luo Fan had sent out back then. Compared to the current situation where he could only barely produce a result after hundreds of collisions, The gap between the two had already reached the level of heaven and earth. At this moment, the result of the battle was that the magic treasure in the hands of the young-like Seven Tribulation expert had been completely destroyed. The dimensional structure inside the magic treasure had been completely destroyed by the dimensional structure inside the palm. Or rather, it had perished together with the dimensional structure inside the palm. At this moment, not only had the dimensional structure inside the gauze-like magic treasure completely disappeared and collapsed, even the palm-like dimensional structure that Luo Fan had sent out had completely collapsed. At this moment, although the two were still in contact with each other like before, the aura that they exuded was completely different from before. In the blink of an eye, the surrounding dimensional chaos had completely engulfed the two. In the end, the two were completely absorbed into the surrounding dimensional chaos. Whether it was the palm or the gauze-like magic treasure, they disappeared without a trace in an instant. They can no longer be found. At the same time that the two disappeared, the young-like Seven Tribulation expert's body also changed. At this moment, because he had lost the protection of the gauze-like magic treasure, he was completely unable to resist the surrounding dimensional chaos and was directly engulfed by it. This kind of engulfment was naturally not like devouring power that was completely shattered and integrated into one's own body. Instead, the dimensional chaos completely controlled the young-like Seventh Tribulation expert. The complete control caused the Seventh Tribulation expert to become a part of the dimensional chaos, adding bricks and tiles to the dimensional chaos. This caused the entire dimensional chaos area to receive a considerable improvement at this moment. Under this improvement, the entire dimensional chaos area became even more difficult to measure. Faced with such a change, the young-like Seven Tribulation expert showed a look of despair. Even if it was him, even if he had a deep understanding of dimensions, even if he could condense his own dimensional structure through various means, he was still a cultivator and not an omnipotent true saint. Faced with this absolute chaotic state, he was already at his wit's end. However, with the strength that Luo Fan had displayed just now and the ability to create that unique dimensional structure at any time, the impact of this chaos on him was obviously quite small. In other words, as long as Yishiwen was willing, he might already be able to do whatever he wanted to him. After understanding this, how could he not feel despair? At this moment, a terrifying impact fiercely acted on this dimensional chaos area. This impact was so powerful that it made Luo Fan feel that his control over the surrounding dimensions seemed to have become inexplicably chaotic. It's here again. At this moment, such a thought flashed in his mind. He was quite familiar with the power that caused this impact. It was the power of the childlike Seventh Tribulation expert that he had encountered several times before. However, compared to when they first encountered each other, the power was a lot fainter and fainter. He could vaguely tell that he had clearly suffered a lot of injuries at this moment. At this moment, his heart stirred slightly. He swept his gaze across, and the light of heaven and earth swiftly swept across, turning into roots that extended towards the outside world. In the blink of an eye, it had already penetrated the dimensional chaos area and directly extended outside, or rather, outside the dimensional chaos area. After arriving outside, the roots of the light of heaven and earth swept in all directions, and in the blink of an eye, it had already discovered the existence that was attacking him. Just as he had expected, this person was the childlike Seventh Tribulation expert. Chapter 2676. At this time, all kinds of subtle distortions appeared around the childlike Seventh Tribulation expert's body. This distortion went deep into the brilliance of the entire fifth level of the Road of Tao Master, and even deep into the essence of the Road of Tao Master. This was obviously not the distortion of space-time by ordinary power, but some kind of change in the surrounding dimension. Luo Fan could tell at a glance that this childlike Seventh Tribulation expert in front of him was unable to fully grasp the ability to change the surrounding dimension, but he forced himself to change it, causing this change to become a half-baked performance. That was to say, at this time, the changes to the surrounding dimension did indeed exist. However, This change was not like a complete change to the dimension, which directly overturned the surrounding space-time and made the surrounding become completely different from the original, but only formed a subtle distortion. However, although this kind of dabbler sounded very ordinary, the truth was that his power was not small. At least, at this time, the impact on the chaotic dimensional structure constructed by Luo Fan was real. At this moment, what was attacking the chaotic dimensional region was the distortion condensed by the childlike Seventh Tribulation expert. This distortion frantically attacked the boundary of the dimensional chaos region, inciting the chaos and causing the dimensional chaos to move closer and closer to the distortion. This approach encountered resistance from the chaotic region and was once again subverted. It was precisely because of this back and forth that the entire chaotic dimensional region was shaking, making it difficult for Luo Fan to make the final blow to the childlike Seventh Tribulation expert. This is a true disciple of a Tao master. His means are really rich. Looking at the means of the childlike Seventh Tribulation expert, Luo Fan could not help but praise. At this time, with a soft poof, the chaotic dimensional region trembled again. This time, it was not because of the childlike impact, but because the disciples of the Tao Masters had escaped from the chaotic dimensional region under the means of the childlike Seventh Tribulation expert. They returned to the outside of the chaotic dimensional region and regained their freedom. In the face of such a situation, Luo Fan just smiled faintly. His eyes did not sweep over the disciples of the Tao Masters at all, but only locked on the childlike Seventh Tribulation expert. Through the roots of his own light of the heavens and the earth-unlike Luo Fan, the childlike Seventh Tribulation expert did not pay any attention to the disciples of the Tao Masters. The moment the disciples of the Tao Masters appeared, he discovered their existence. When he found that there were only tens of thousands of Tao Masters left, there was an indescribable killing intent in his eyes. These were his junior brothers and sisters. Now, out of the hundreds of millions of junior brothers and sisters, only a few tens of thousands were left. Where did the rest go? Is there even a need to ask regardless of whether they were dead or had already triggered their own backup plan and entered the Tao Master's prison? It was obviously an unimaginable blow to them. It was a great persecution to their cultivation. Luo Fan, who had done this, could be said to be an irreconcilable enemy of his, no matter what he had done. In order to protect the interests of the disciples of the Tao Master, he was even willing to give up his own thinking and his own self. Now that he saw that hundreds of millions of his junior brothers and sisters had died, how could he bear it? At this moment, he let out a roar and released all of his power. Under this release of power, the power of the Tao Master's prison emerged out of thin air and pressed down on him. If this was all, then what awaited the disciples was obviously directly sent to the Tao Master's prison. Obviously, this was not the goal of the disciple at this time. He wanted to pull Luo Fan into the abyss as well. Therefore, at this time, he did not stop at all. In a flash, he fiercely rushed towards Luo Fan. There was a dimensional distortion around his body. This dimensional distortion caused him to be on the same level as the dimensional chaos zone where Luo Fan was. The effect of being on the same level was that when his body crashed into the dimensional chaos zone, he suffered a great repulsion from the dimensional chaos zone. The repulsion effect was enough to greatly affect his speed. In fact, if he was like before, such a method would not even be enough for him to rush into the dimensional chaos zone. However, this time, it was obviously different from before. At this time, he had completely thrown caution to the wind. When his body was obstructed, he instantly exploded his body parts, transforming them into boundless might. Boundless power poured into the dimensional distortions around his body, causing the dimensional distortions to rapidly strengthen, eliminating the hindrance of the dimensional distortions. His speed continued to increase, and he continued to drill into the region of dimensional distortions at a rapid speed. Tao Master's prison again. Luo Fan frowned at this time. This method was not new. It was somewhat similar to the methods used by the disciples of the Tao Masters. However, of course, as a method used by a Seventh Tribulation expert, This method was ultimately different from the methods used by the disciples of the Tao Masters. Previously, the disciples of the Tao Masters only wanted to expose Luo Fan to the Tao Masters' prison. In fact, they did not have any means to make the power of the Tao Masters' prison target him and directly suppress him. At this time, this child's seventh tribulation expert was different. Could it be that the seventh tribulation expert wanted to completely merge himself with his own dimensional zone? Through this merging, he could directly bind himself and Luo Fan together. Through this binding, once the power of the Tao Master's prison was used on him, it was equivalent to using it on Luo Fan. In this way, as long as the power of the Tao Master's prison wanted to suppress him and seal him into the Tao Master's prison, then it would definitely seal Luo Fan into the Tao Master's prison as well. In this way, as long as the power of the Tao Master's prison wanted to suppress him and seal him into the Tao Master's prison, then it would definitely seal Luo Fan into the Tao Master's prison as well. Obviously, this method proved that the childlike seven tribulation expert had already thought through everything that might have happened. In other words, he had thought through the methods that the disciples of the Tao Masters might have used against Luo Fan. After thinking through these methods, he naturally knew the possible characteristics of Luo Fan. It was precisely because of this that he could directly use the most basic and direct method to activate the power of the Tao Master's prison and seal himself and Luo Fan into the Tao Master's prison. After all, Luo Fan might have a method to bypass the power of the Tao Master's prison. However, he did not. He was a disciple of the Tao Master, but he was still a seven tribulation expert. As a seven tribulation expert, no matter what he did in the fifth level of the Tao Master's prison, he would be targeted by the Tao Master's prison. Once he was completely exposed to the power of the Tao Master's prison, then what awaited him would be directly sealing him. After understanding this, a trace of admiration flashed across Luo Fan's heart. There are actually cultivators who can abandon everything for the sake of the overall benefit. This thought emerged in his heart. He knew that in order to do this, the disciples of the Tao Master had to pay a huge price. This price was not just a small price of being sealed into the Tao Master's prison. Most importantly, it was likely that at this moment, he had to pay a price in order to break through the barrier of the chaotic dimensional region that he had formed. At this moment, what he had detonated was not just a part of his physical body. If it was just a part of his physical body, it was nothing to cultivators of his level. Any cultivator of this level could have the concept of immortality. In other words, even if his entire body was erased, as long as the concept of his existence still existed, he could still be resurrected. Moreover, it was resurrection without any side effects. In that case, even if his physical body was completely destroyed, it would not affect the reality at all. How could it bring about such a powerful enhancement without any side effects? Therefore, it was clear that what he had detonated was an even more wondrous existence, and also an even more important existence. It was none other than his existence itself. In other words, if he were to detonate his arm now, then his arm would truly and completely disappear. Even if he could be resurrected in the future, even if he had already stopped moving, his arm would never be able to recover. Even if he was powerful and had extraordinary means to create a similar arm out of thin air, creating an existence that was exactly the same as his original arm to attach to his shoulder, the arm would still explode as soon as it was formed. The arm would explode as soon as it was fully formed, not because of the natural laws of the outside world, but rather because of his own will, his very essence, which would cause the arm to explode. This change was quite mysterious, and the principle behind it was even more complicated and indescribable. With this understanding, Luo Fan naturally could not just watch as the other party continued to go deeper into the chaotic dimensional region. He tried his best to gather the roots of the light of heaven and earth and quickly moved towards the childlike seventh tribulation expert. The chaotic dimensional region didn't just restrict seventh tribulation experts like that young man. It was also a restriction for him. Under this restriction, he could not use normal dimensional means to deal with the invading cultivators. Of course, he still had some advantages. After the roots of the light of heaven and earth formed a little barrier around the childlike seventh tribulation expert, a palm appeared out of thin air in that area and fiercely slapped towards the distortion. That palm was none other than the dimensional stable region formed by the combination of Luo Fan's worldview and the roots of the light of heaven and earth. This dimensional stable region was even able to forcefully slap the magic treasure of the childlike seventh tribulation expert into an ordinary object. One could imagine how powerful it was. At this moment, the dimensional stable palm slammed into the dimensional distortion of the other party. In an instant, the dimensional distorted region trembled slightly and produced an even more intense distortion. However, this kind of distortion was not the same distortion that the childlike seventh tribulation expert had created with all his might. This time, the distortion was chaotic. In other words, it was a distortion caused by the destruction of the originally orderly distortion. The two distortions here seem to be distortions, but in fact, there was a great conflict between them. At this moment, the two distortions collided and produced a subtle chaos, causing the childlike seventh tribulation expert's ability to control the surrounding dimensional distortions to weaken. At this moment, the childlike seventh tribulation expert already felt that the power of the Tao Master's prison had already caught hold of the dimensional distortions where he was. It looked like it was about to penetrate his body and pull him directly into the Tao Master's prison. Under such circumstances, this sudden obstruction was simply fatal to him. In the face of such an obstruction, he made a prompt decision and once again detonated his two legs. Boom, 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 boom amidst the loud explosions. His ability to control the surrounding dimensional distortions was greatly enhanced, and the power of the distortions was also greatly enhanced. Under this enhancement, Luo Fan's palm, which was blocking the distortion in front of him, also suffered an incredible impact. Amidst rumbling sounds, the palm collapsed with a loud bang, and all the dimensional structures within it disappeared, completely devoured by the endless dimensional chaos in the surroundings. The entire process seemed to take a long time, but from the moment the childlike seventh tribulation expert activated the power of the Tao Master's prison until now, only a millionth of a second had passed. This short period of time was not much different from transcending time. Luo Fan had long anticipated his opponent's means and knew of his opponent's sacrifice. At this moment, he naturally could not only use this method to stop his opponent. At this moment, he was not surprised to see his hand being obliterated. Another hand appeared out of thin air. However, this palm was no longer simply blocking or slapping like before. Instead, it was directly using some kind of indescribable technique, forming an indescribable handprint. It erupted with a terrifying power that was thousands or tens of thousands of times stronger than before and fiercely slapped forward. Chapter 2677. Amidst the distortion, the chaotic dimensional region around Luo Fan's body began to shake violently. The palm formed by the stable dimensional structure also began to collapse at this moment. Amidst the collapse, the palm also began to retreat continuously, making way for the distorted dimensional region to enter. Evidently, the sacrifice of the childlike seventh tribulation expert was not in vain. At this moment, faced with such a sacrifice, Luo Fan was actually at his wit's end. It's really incomprehensibly powerful. Such a thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind at this moment. His brows furrowed even deeper. At this moment, he began to think about whether he should directly release the chaotic dimensional region and directly escape the threat of the other party. After all, if this went on, the other party would be able to completely squeeze into the chaotic dimensional region and completely integrate with it before his body was completely exhausted. Once his body was completely integrated with the chaotic dimensional region, then Luo Fan would be completely tied to the childlike seventh tribulation expert. Once this binding was completed, then based on the current situation of the childlike seventh tribulation expert, it was inevitable that both of them would be sealed and imprisoned in the Tao Master's prison at the same time. In comparison, at this moment, as long as he released the chaotic dimensional region, then he would be able to separate himself from the chaotic dimensional region. Furthermore, the chaotic dimensional region would also completely disappear. At that time, as long as he avoided the childlike seven tribulation expert, then the childlike seven tribulation expert would no longer be able to completely connect himself with him. And if they could not be connected, then the childlike seven tribulation expert's sacrifice would be in vain. However, if he did that, the childlike seven tribulation expert would regain his freedom. Once he regained his freedom, given that he had not suffered much damage yet, and even compared to the methods that the childlike seven tribulation expert could use, it was conceivable that he would definitely be a huge threat to Luo Fan. If this situation were to happen, then all of Luo Fan's previous efforts would probably be in vain. This was also the source of Luo Fan's hesitation. These thoughts kept flashing through Luo Fan's mind. Although there were many thoughts, with Luo Fan's ability to think clearly, even after he thought through the pros and cons, not even a fraction of a billionth of the time had passed. In such a short period of time, the childlike seven tribulation expert clearly hadn't advanced much. He still had the chance to make his own choice. As he made this choice, his heart trembled slightly. His expression became calm, and his entire body trembled slightly. He had already understood what was the most correct choice for him. The enemy could be dealt with at any time. Even if all his previous efforts were in vain, he could still take action at any time and finish off the enemy. However, if he was sealed and completely suppressed, then the situation would obviously be different. If that was the case, all his efforts would be for naught. Even he himself would lose all hope. Knowing this, was there any need to say what he would choose? At this moment, he quickly withdrew his power and rushed out of the outside world. Obviously, he wanted to directly abandon the chaotic dimensional region so that he could escape without being implicated. Although the chaotic dimensional region was an absolutely chaotic region, and cultivators could only rely on their own bodies to move around in it. However, for someone like Luo Fan, who created the chaotic dimensional region, he still had an advantage. For example, his familiarity with the chaotic dimensional region allowed him to find some regions that weren't that chaotic. This allowed him to move forward without too many obstacles, allowing him to increase his speed. It was precisely because of this convenience that at this moment, Luo Fan had already reached the edge of the chaotic dimensional region. He was about to directly rush out of the chaotic dimensional region and escape. At this moment, a figure appeared in front of him and fiercely threw a punch at him. "Do you also want to die?" At this moment, Luo Fan couldn't help but smile bitterly. He raised his hand to grab the punch. That punch seemed ordinary, but contained millions upon millions of variations. It even surpassed time, karma, space, and fate. No matter what Luo Fan did, he couldn't dodge that punch. He could only face it head-on. That person was none other than the young-looking Seventh Tribulation Powerhouse. At this moment, the Seventh Tribulation Powerhouse didn't have that gauze-like magic treasure anymore. At least, the dimensional stability region contained in that magic treasure had completely disappeared. In this chaotic dimensional region, it was no longer of any use. Under such circumstances, the only methods he could use here were the various methods he could use with his own body. In other words, it was the technique he had used in the battle against the childlike Seven Tribulation Powerhouse. If it was an ordinary cultivator, such methods naturally wouldn't pose much of a threat. However, he was a Seven Tribulation Powerhouse after all. He already had a body understanding of the essence of cultivation, and his use of his body had also reached an incredible level. For such an existence, there was naturally no need to say much about the strength of the methods he used with his body. It could be said that just using his body was already enough to overturn the perfect cultivation system of the world. At this moment, the methods and power he used with his body were probably something that even a Sixth Tribulation Powerhouse couldn't compare to in some aspects. Such an attack directly pounced on him. For Luo Fan, it was self-evident how great the threat was. In that instant, he felt as if he had been thrown into an Azura battlefield. It was as if he had returned to the land of opportunity where all of his extraordinary abilities had been sealed. He could only instinctively block his opponent's incessant attacks. If it was under normal circumstances, as long as he was given some time, he would definitely be able to quickly eliminate this predicament. Then, he would be able to display his worldview and bring the surroundings into a stable structure. In that case, he would be able to greatly suppress his opponent and eventually defeat him easily. However, this was not an ordinary time. At this moment, he was running for his life. If he was delayed by this person in front of him, very soon, the childlike seven tribulation powerhouse's methods would be effective. At that time, he would be able to crush this cultivator in front of him and make him die without a burial place. So what if his soul was destroyed and he would never be able to reincarnate? If he can be sacrificed, I can naturally be sacrificed too. It's too dangerous for us to leave you behind. So, let's enter the Tao Master's prison together. The young like seven tribulation powerhouse spoke at this moment. At this moment, his eyes were extremely firm and his actions were extremely decisive. The power in his body flowed erratically, and the power in his body seemed to be completely twisted at this moment. Terrifying power constantly leaked out between his hands and feet. He completely disregarded his own safety and only focused on stopping Luo Fan, so that Luo Fan couldn't smoothly leave this dimensional chaos zone. A part of this dimensional chaos zone also belonged to him. At the very least, if the entire dimensional chaos zone did not have his addition to the dimension, then it would only be an area of dimensional abnormalities controlled by Luo Fan. But it would definitely not turn to chaos. Under such circumstances, he naturally had a certain degree of control over this dimensional chaos zone. Of course, this control was not to make the dimensional chaos zone into order or to use the power of this dimensional chaos zone to achieve a specific effect. It was only to be able to control the degree of chaos in this dimensional chaos zone. In other words, he could make this dimensional chaos zone even more chaotic, and he could also make a certain location in this dimensional chaos zone less chaotic. It was nothing more than strengthening his own distortion of the dimension and weakening its influence on the dimension. At this moment, although it seemed that he was only focused on attacking Luo Fan, at the same time, he was also distorting the dimension around his body, which also meant that the dimension around him became increasingly chaotic. The more chaotic the dimension, the greater the restrictions on the cultivators in it. This was the case even for a part of the dimensional chaos zone. Because of this, Luo Fan felt that the situation around him had become increasingly complicated. The boundary that he was originally just a step away from breaking through had started to become distant. Looks like I can only choose the lesser of two evils. Luo Fan could only smile bitterly at this moment. At this moment, he could already sense that the childlike seven tribulation expert was about to completely integrate into this dimensional chaos zone. In other words, this person's plan was about to succeed. Under such circumstances, he clearly didn't have the time to escape from this chaotic dimensional region. He also didn't have the time to get rid of the seven tribulation expert in front of him before leaving this region. If he could not resolve the crisis that he was about to be sealed by the power of the Tao Master's prison, then he would most likely enter the Tao Master's prison again in the next instant. This time, if he entered, it would not be as easy as when he first stepped into the Tao Master's prison. Back then, the reason why he was able to easily escape the Tao Master's prison was because the taboo he committed was too small. It was so small that it was between being sealed by the Tao Master's prison and not being sealed by it. After that, he had the help of a certain cultivator. But now, his situation was different. The power of the Tao Master's prison that the childlike seven tribulation expert had attracted was many times stronger than before. In other words, in the eyes of the Tao Sovereign's prison, the taboo he had committed was many times more severe than before. In this way, the power of the seal would definitely be many times stronger than before. With his current strength, he did not have any confidence that he could escape again. In other words, if he was really sealed, he would have to be prepared to be sealed forever. Evidently, this was something that Luo Fan could not accept. At that moment, he could only smile bitterly and do something that he thought he would never do. In that instant, he completely withdrew all of his power and completely eliminated the changes to the surrounding dimensions. As he completely eliminated the changes to the surrounding dimensions, the originally chaotic region of dimensions paused for a moment. Then, it began to rapidly disappear. Very quickly, the originally chaotic state turned into an orderly state. The reason why the chaotic region of dimensions appeared chaotic was because the two-dimensional changes intertwined and clashed. Under such circumstances, if one of the dimensional changes was suddenly removed, then only the other dimensional changes would be left. And the other dimensional changes would naturally not turn into dimensional chaos. Naturally, it would turn into the orderly state of the dimensional anomaly. However, even though this seemed simple and ordinary, the repercussions were endless in the end. This was because the orderly state of the dimensional anomaly was under the control of the young cultivator. In other words, after making this change, Luo Fan was already lying on the chopping board of the other party, waiting for the other party to choose a more convenient position to dissect him. This kind of thing was obviously giving the other party something to use against him so that the other party could deal with him at will. In the past, Luo Fan did not think that he would do such a thing. At this time, the other party only needed to have a single thought to bring him great harm in an instant. In fact, if the other party was clever, it would be enough to get rid of him completely. In other words, as long as the other party reacted at this time, there was a possibility of completely erasing Luo Fan. "I've waited for a long time." The young cultivator roared at this moment. Following this roar, power surged all over his body. Under his control, this dimensional anomaly region produced all kinds of incredible changes, and a terrifying power crushed down on Luo Fan. In the blink of an eye, Luo Fan felt that all traces of his existence had been erased in an instant. Chapter 2678. After Luo Fan removed his dimensional change from the dimensional chaos region, the dimensional chaos region had already become the complete possession of the seventh tribulation powerhouse, who looked like the young man. This complete possession meant that the dimensional chaos region had already been filled with the mark of the seventh tribulation powerhouse, who looked like the young man. As for the mark of Luo Fan that originally existed in it, it had already been completely removed as Luo Fan removed the dimensional change. Under such circumstances, everything that the childlike Seven Tribulation Powerhouse had done had already been completely accepted by the Seven Tribulation Powerhouse. In other words, his original target had already shifted from Luo Fan to the Seven Tribulation Powerhouse. If this young-looking Seven Tribulation Powerhouse could make a prompt decision to first cut off the influence exerted by himself and the surrounding dimensional structure, just like Luo Fan, he could also remove the imprint that he had integrated into the surrounding dimensional structure. In that case, he would still be able to escape. At least, if the childlike Seven Tribulation Powerhouse did not regard him as a direct target, he would no longer be affected. However, it was a pity that at that moment, he did not choose to escape. Instead, he chose to attack Luo Fan. This attack seemed to have completely erased Luo Fan. But at the same time, it also cut off his last hope of escaping. This also resulted in the current situation. His dimensional change directly merged with the Seventh Tribulation Powerhouse's distortion of the surrounding dimensions. The two were completely tied together, and in the end, the power of the Tao Master's prison directly enveloped the two Seventh Tribulation Powerhouses who had already connected their chi. In an instant, they were completely pulled into the Tao Master's prison and were sealed in the most powerful way possible. "I'm sorry, senior brother." At the last moment, the childlike Seventh Tribulation Powerhouse said with a wry smile. At this moment, only his head was left of his body. Apart from his head, all other parts of his body had been sacrificed and converted into the power to push forward just now. Hearing this, the young-looking Seventh Tribulation Powerhouse chuckled and said, "It's nothing, this is my own choice." Fortunately, our sacrifice was not in vain. In the end, that enemy has been eliminated. The childlike expert smiled bitterly again and said, "I'm afraid it's not that simple. Senior brother, you haven't really fought him, so you don't know how strange he is. I still remember him, so perhaps he is not completely dead. We are now sealed, and there is no longer anything we can do to him. A look of disbelief appeared on the young-looking Seventh Tribulation powerhouse's face. At the same time, deep annoyance appeared in his eyes. He naturally believed in his junior brother. At the very least, his junior brother didn't have any reason to lie to him at this moment. Under such circumstances, he naturally understood that his junior brother's words clearly meant that Luo Fan really didn't think that his previous efforts had been erased. In that case, what was the point of his sacrifice? At this moment, he couldn't help but start to regret. He regretted that he was too impulsive at the last moment. If he had known this earlier, he wouldn't have chosen to sacrifice himself to attack Luo Fan at the last moment. After all, as long as he could survive, then even if he couldn't deal with Luo Fan, he could still summon his companions, his senior brother or senior sister who was more powerful than him, just like how the childlike Seventh Tribulation expert had summoned him just now. In that case, no matter how powerful Luo Fan was, he could only die in the end, and his soul could only scatter. After all, how could a single cultivator compare to countless disciples of Tao Masters? However, it was already too late for regrets. Although the two of them had communicated so much, in reality, the time they spent communicating was close to zero. Even with this close to zero communication, the power of the Tao Master's prison still hadn't pulled them into the Tao Master's prison. In this instant, they could still observe their surroundings and see the various situations on the 5th level of the Tao Master's path. Now, we can only rely on them. The childlike expert revealed a helpless look at this moment. He was naturally referring to the disciples of the Tao Masters. If they could do it, the disciples of the Tao Masters should be able to do it too. At the very least, the disciples of the Tao Masters should have the means to summon some of the higher-level senior brothers and senior sisters. We can only rely on them. I hope they're smart, the young-like expert said with a wry smile. As they had such thoughts, the power of the Tao Lord's prison had already brought them into the 5th level of the Tao Lord's prison, completely sealing them in the Tao Lord's prison. The Tao Master's prison was quite mysterious. It was both a mechanism to punish cultivators and a mechanism to deal with enemies. If one entered the Tao Master's prison of their own accord, they would naturally be able to freely enter and exit the Tao Master's prison after a period of time. However, if that was the case, they would need to help the disciples of the Tao Master's path fight against external enemies. In fact, there were quite a number of such battles. However, this didn't mean that all cultivators would receive the same treatment after entering the Tao Master's prison. If one made a mistake and was sealed into the Tao Master's prison, the situation would be completely different. If one was sealed into the Tao Master's prison, even the lightest punishment would have to be suppressed for many years. If the punishment was more severe, one might even be directly thrown into the battlefield as cannon fodder in the battle against the other disciples of the Tao Master's prison. Of course, this kind of punishment could be considered polarizing. Therefore, if one's means were clever enough, they might be able to make some contributions through this kind of opportunity and reduce the time they would be punished by the Tao Master's prison. They might even be able to reduce the punishment a little. However, no matter how much it changed, there was still a lower limit to this kind of punishment. And this lower limit was obviously calculated in terms of hundreds of millions of years. Therefore, no matter what kind of treatment or clever means were used to be sealed into the Tao Master's prison, it would at least mean that one's cultivation would be delayed for hundreds of millions of years, or even hundreds of millions of years. This was obviously a price that no cultivator was willing to pay. The childlike Seven Tribulation expert and the young-like Seven Tribulation expert were obviously very clever. It was obviously not a problem for them to receive the best treatment. However, no matter how good the treatment was, it meant that they would no longer be able to participate in the battle on the 5th level of the Tao Master's prison. In other words, even if they could escape from the Tao Master's prison in the shortest time possible, it would no longer be able to change anything that happened on the 5th level of the Tao Master's prison. Of course, it was more likely that by the time they escaped, everything here would no longer be salvageable. Among them, the childlike Seven Tribulation expert's treatment was a little more tragic. At this moment, he was only left with his head. Moreover, it was completely irreparable and only his head was left. In other words, no matter how strong he was, No matter how incredible his regenerative means were, he would at most be able to restore his head. At the very least, with the childlike seventh tribulation expert's means, he could not think of any way to restore the body parts that had sacrificed previously. In this way, to him, his race could almost be considered to have changed. He had become a race that only had his head. In this state, no matter how good his means were, it was obvious that he could not do it in a short period of time. It was inevitable for him to be sealed for a long period of time. As for what would happen to the disciples of the two Tao Masters after being sealed in the Tao Master's prison, Luo Fan naturally did not care. At this moment, his figure slowly materialized in the real world. Compared to before, his figure appeared much slower this time. Vaguely, there was an inexplicable feeling of strain. What a strange attack. If it wasn't for my brilliant means, I would have died and my soul scattered. After taking form, he could not help but sigh inwardly. In that instant, the attack that the young-like seventh tribulation expert exerted on him was completely based on the surrounding dimensional structure. The effect of this kind of attack was quite incredible. At that moment, not only did he feel that everything about him in the real plane had been erased, but he also felt that the connection between his plane and the other planes had suffered an incredible impact and was almost completely cut off. If this connection was cut off, then, for him, death would be real death. There were all kinds of incredible connections between the planes. This connection, if used through communication, would allow Luo Fan to obtain an immortal body. Regardless of which plane he was in, if his corresponding existence died, or if his soul was scattered, he would be able to recover through his corresponding existence in other planes. This was also where his greatest immortality lay. This immortality, however, had two weaknesses that could not be considered weaknesses. One of them was that the corresponding plane he corresponded to was not invincible in itself. If there was any power that could completely erase the corresponding plane he corresponded to in an instant, then he would also be completely erased, and this immortality would no longer have any effect. Previously, those Tao Masters had paid a huge price to summon the true divine figure to launch an attack, and they had almost achieved this. In addition to this weakness, which could not be considered a weakness, the other weakness was even more obvious. That weakness was none other than the connection between his various planes. This connection was indeed quite mysterious. It could bring him endless benefits, increase his power, and improve his nature by hundreds of millions of times. But, at the same time, this connection itself was just a connection. If there was really a way to capture this connection, it would not be too difficult to cut it off. Once this connection was cut off, what would happen to things? Once this connection was cut off, then Luo Fan's immortality would completely disappear. He might still be able to have a concept of immortality. In this plane of reality, he could be destroyed to a certain extent in the eyes of ordinary practitioners, but he could still be completely resurrected. However, that was all. Once all the concepts of his existence in the plane of reality were erased, then he would really be destroyed, and his body and Tao would disappear. Just now, what the young seven tribulation expert had done was similar to this method. He had almost completely cut off the connection between Luo Fan and many other planes. In the end, he did not completely succeed. He had only cut off 99% of the connection and did not really rely on this method to completely erase him. However, it also made Luo Fan's heart palpitate. He only felt that for the first time in a long time, he really felt death approaching him. This kind of feeling of death was even many times stronger than when he faced the figure of the true divine. At that moment, he even thought that he was already really dead. If it wasn't for the fact that the other party's methods did not completely target that connection and left a shred of it behind, he would be able to use the connection between many planes that had not been completely severed to repair everything in the real world. In the end, he would be able to use that repair to restore that connection. It was precisely because of this that his recovery this time was unprecedentedly slow. It was impossible to be like before. Once his body in the plane of reality died, he could immediately completely recover through that connection, and the whole process almost did not consume any time at all. It seems that this immortality is not completely flawless. In the future, I can't rely on this method to court death. At this moment, such a thought flashed in Luo Fan's mind. An indescribable vigilance appeared in his eyes, as well as a kind of cautiousness that had disappeared for a long time. He had just regained some of it, but it was still not very strong. Just as these various changes occurred to him, he suddenly felt an indescribable power suddenly descend from the sky and instantly enveloped him. As this enveloped him, he found that everything around him had become blurred. There seemed to be an inexplicable existence obscuring his vision, perception, and even everything else. Chapter 2679. This is a great trial. However, Luo Fan soon realized what he had encountered. The reason why he was able to react was not because he had seen the surroundings clearly. How could he see clearly? The reason why he was able to react was because he suddenly felt that the seventh trial, which was originally suspended above his head and seemed to be about to descend at any time, had disappeared without a trace. The great trial that came because of his cultivation naturally would not disappear into thin air. Therefore, it was obvious that he could not feel the great trial floating above his head. Naturally, there was only one possibility. That was, the great trial had already descended and he was already in the midst of the great trial. He did not know the true face of Mount Lu because he was in this mountain. Why did it suddenly descend? Did what I did trigger something? Realizing that he was already in the midst of the great trial, this doubt emerged in his heart. In terms of cultivation realm, as early as when he returned from that place of opportunity, he had already met the qualifications to trigger the seventh trial. However, since then, for such a long time, the great trial had only been suspended above his head, in a state where it was about to descend. It seemed that it would descend at any time, but it did not descend no matter what. The reason why he had previously helped the alliance of itinerant cultivators was to create some trouble and see if he could trigger the great trial to descend. It could be said that after creating such a big movement, causing almost all the disciples of the Tao Masters in the 5th floor of the Tao Masters Road, and causing 2 disciples from the 7th floor of the Tao Masters Road to be completely sealed by the Tao Masters prison, could only be regarded as an accident. At this time, judging from his experience, it was obvious that he had done so many things before, but he did not know what kind of behavior had met the prerequisites for the 7th trial to descend, so that the 7th trial finally descended after a long time of preparation. After thinking carefully for a long time, finally, Luo Fan could only think of one possibility. That was, after a long time, he had once again developed a heart of reverence. It was not a heart of reverence for a true sage. He had never lacked that kind of reverence. Instead, it was a heart of reverence for an existence whose strength was weaker than his, or at least not stronger than his. And the source of this reverence came from his realization that he was now not perfect. He realized that he still did not have the qualifications to ignore everything. He could still be erased by an existence whose strength was inferior to his. Even if that existence did not have the power to attract a true saint, the figure of a true saint, or the divine sense of a true saint, it was still the same. However, he did not know why this reverence would cause the great calamity to descend. Perhaps it's because of a flaw? This thought suddenly appeared in Luo Fan's mind, causing his expression to become somewhat inexplicable. If that was the case, then the target of the great calamity this time might be roughly limited. Of course, these were just his fleeting thoughts. He naturally did not know the specifics, and there was no way for him to confirm it this time. Why hasn't there been any movement from the Great Tribulation? After a long time, he gradually felt surprised. There was no other reason. At this time, he felt that a long time had passed, but his surroundings were still in that indescribable state. Everything about him was still concealed, making it impossible for him to sense the situation around him. It was as if everything around him was just a strange state of nothingness that didn't even exist. Time gradually passed while he was still in shock. Before he knew it, several days had already passed. After a few days, no matter how ignorant Luo Fan was, he had figured out what was going on. This state is a calamity. This kind of understanding gradually emerged in his heart over the past few days. From this point of view, it was only natural. Although he had not encountered such a calamity before, if it really appeared, it would really be extremely difficult to deal with it. However, this was his seventh great calamity. No matter what kind of calamity appeared, what kind of appearance, or what kind of unbelievable changes, it was not worth being surprised. Therefore, after confirming that this situation might be a normal manifestation of a calamity, his mood slightly calmed down. At that moment, he began to use all his means to break the almost absolute concealment in the surroundings. It was a pity that all of his probing methods, be it physical perception or spiritual perception, which are of a higher level, could not have any effect on such a powerful concealment in front of him. This powerful concealment was like an eternally unmoving background. One couldn't even touch it, let alone break it. Although he could sense that all of his senses had clearly extended out of his body, he seemed to have come into contact with something. However, the feedback was completely the same as what his senses had seen. In other words, there was not a single trace of information being fed back. In fact, he did not even know what his perception had come into contact with, whether his perception still existed, whether it was still wandering in the outside world, or whether it had been completely crushed by something in the outside world. Facing this change, Luo Fan was not discouraged. After all, this was a test of the Great Calamity. If it was so easy to break through the test of the Great Calamity, then this Great Calamity would be a joke. Although he could not find a way to transcend it all, and seemed to have been completely restricted in this state, compared to the most dangerous encounters in the previous Great Calamities, such a restriction was nothing. At least, his life was not in much danger. Despite this mentality, he did not give up and wait for death just because he could not find a way to break through this concealment. Instead, he used all of his wisdom and all of the achievements that he had cultivated over hundreds of billions of years, and worked hard to find a new way to break through this concealment. Luo Fan's understanding of cultivation was so profound that it far surpassed that of cultivators of the same level. In other words, even a seven tribulation powerhouse would have a considerable gap compared to him. Under such circumstances, it went without saying that he would gain great benefits by wholeheartedly exploring this aspect of perception. In just a few years, he felt that he had advanced the path of perception to a depth that he dared not imagine in the past. At this moment, he was even confident that even if he became an ordinary person, he would be able to figure out the general situation of a strange world within a few breaths of time. Before he advanced the path of perception, if he became an ordinary person, it would probably take him a few days to figure out these things. This kind of harvest could definitely be considered as incomparably shocking. However, the final result of such an incomparably shocking achievement was that he did not achieve the goal that he wanted to achieve. Even with the help of his great advancement in the path of perception, he still could not break through the almost absolute concealment around him. In other words, at this moment, everything about him was still concealed. He still could not know the situation around him, and he could not even determine what state he was in. His understanding of his surroundings and of himself was still the same as it had been a few years ago. There was not the slightest difference. It's really not that easy. Years of hard work did not work on his situation, but did not make Luo Fan give up and wait for death. However, it also made him know that he needed a new way of thinking. Over the past few years, he had poured all his energy into the path of perception, causing his attainments in the path of perception to far surpass his original self. Even seven tribulation experts would rarely be able to match up to this level of depth. However, this kind of harvest was not affected by the Great Calamity at all. In fact, it did not even cause any changes to the concealment around him. This was enough to show that he had deviated from the direction he was heading in. In fact, it was a mistake. Immediately, he withdrew his perception and no longer looked outwards. Instead, he probed the many other planes. As he probed, the existences that corresponded to him in the many other planes started to appear in his perception. The various encounters of the existences that corresponded to him in the various planes were also transmitted into his perception. It's the same. After carefully comparing them, he was sure that the existences that corresponded to him in the various planes were the same as the existences that corresponded to him in reality. They were also almost completely concealed and could not sense the outside world or even himself. If it was not for Luo Fan's great understanding of the connections between the various planes, he might not have been able to tell which plane he was in just by shifting his perception. Was it the plane of reality, the plane of concepts, the plane of cause and effect, the plane of illusion, the plane of fate, or some other, even more unbelievable plane? Evidently, Luo Fan would not give up so easily. If one plane did not work, he would shift to another plane. If another plane did not work, he would shift to another plane. Just like this, he shifted his perception to every plane that he had communicated with. In the end, after spending a few months, he confirmed that he had not missed out on a single plane. In all the planes, the existences that corresponded to him received the same treatment. They were similarly concealed by some indescribable existence that had been born from the Great Tribulation. They were completely and utterly concealed. After discovering this, Luo Fan sighed inwardly. He withdrew his perception, guarded himself, and immersed himself in the accumulation of an unknown number of billions of years. He began to try one reasonable or absurd angle after another. He began to try them one by one. Given how deep Luo Fan's accumulation was, these attempts were clearly an extremely long process. Even if each attempt only took a few days, it would probably take him tens of thousands of years to complete all of them. Not to mention, due to the different characteristics of each experiment, the amount of time needed to complete them was also different. At the very least, it would take a few days to be able to confirm that these attempts were not feasible and had no chance of success. Ordinary attempts would probably take more than a few months to reach a final conclusion. In fact, some attempts even took him several years to reach a conclusion. Because of this, the process of trying it out became even longer. Time continued to pass in Luo Fan's perception. Unknowingly, 100,000 years had passed. Over the 100,000 years, Luo Fan had tried billions of possibilities. Most of them were determined to be absurd in just a few days, and it was impossible for them to help him in his current situation. However, even though there were extremely few possibilities that were worth exploring, it had already taken him such a long time. During 100,000 years, he was completely unable to sense the outside world, unable to sense himself, and even unable to determine if he was dead or alive. He could not determine if he was attacked or injured. For ordinary living beings, no matter how strong they were, their minds would probably collapse. However, for Luo Fan, billions of years were equivalent to an instant. Therefore, even after 100,000 years, his mood did not change at all, and he did not have any negative emotions because of it. At this moment, his mentality was still the same as it was 100,000 years ago. He was not discouraged, nor was he excited. There was only calmness. I can't get through this concealment. It's not a concealment of any nature that I know of. Instead, it's a deeper, more fundamental, more powerful, more absolute, more profound, and more indescribable concealment. After 100,000 years of trying, although Luo Fan did not find a way to break through the concealment, he had eliminated countless possibilities. At this moment, after 100,000 years of trying billions of possibilities, he could clearly come to such a conclusion. After coming to such a conclusion, he naturally thought of another existence. The other, in every respect, has always been able to be substituted for these descriptions. The words chaotic state naturally appeared in the depths of his heart. Chapter 2680. At the thought of the state of chaos, he suddenly had a lot of inspiration that he didn't have before. For him, what kind of existence was the state of chaos? It was an existence that he couldn't understand at all now. If he fell into it, even his everything would be completely melted and assimilated. If he were to get rid of all kinds of corrosive damage and fall into such an existence, the feeling would be quite similar to the state he was in now. Similarly, all of his senses and senses were completely blocked, and even his own senses were no exception. Combined with what he was going through at this time, He quickly understood that he was probably in some kind of simulation of the state of chaos. Although this kind of simulation was vastly different from the simulation that he had previously known, which used time, space, matter, energy, and other mysterious existences that he could understand and couldn't understand to mix together in an incomparably chaotic manner. It was completely different. However, he had to admit that this was clearly also a simulation that was even more difficult to deal with. If it's really a simulation of the state of chaos, then perhaps the method to deal with the state of chaos can also be used here. This thought quickly emerged in Luo Fan's mind. With this thought, his worldview began to appear around his body out of thin air. An unimaginable and terrifying pressure acted on his worldview out of thin air at this moment, making him feel as if he had become an ordinary person and was being suppressed by a huge mountain. Ga, all kinds of visible and invisible sounds came from all over his body. The pain of incompatibility was also constantly surging. Feeling this pain, Luo Fan didn't regret his choice because of it. On the contrary, he was inexplicably excited. Of course, it wasn't because he had some weird hobby of getting excited because of pain. Rather, it was because he knew that his choice was right. There was no other reason. Before this, even his perception of his body was completely blocked by the existence that might be a simulation of the state of chaos around him. In that state, it was impossible for him to feel the slightest bit of his body, be it pain or happiness. And now, he was feeling the pain. This obviously meant that, to a certain extent, he had already broken through the absolute concealment around him. Even though all he felt now was pain, it was already a breakthrough, after all, which meant that he was sitting on the right path. Therefore, the materialization of the worldview was quite difficult. At the very least, it was thousands or even tens of millions of times more difficult than when he used the worldview of laws to condense the dimensional structure. At every moment, he could feel that there was an incredible pressure from the outside world acting directly on the worldview that he was currently materializing. The more his worldview was perfected, the more the pressure would increase, causing him to be constantly pushed to his limits. He was constantly in a state where he could be broken by the pressure in the next moment, and everything about him would be crushed. In such a state, although he felt that he was on the right path and had found a breakthrough to break out of his predicament, he could only feel the pain coming from all parts of his body at most. Apart from that, he had yet to feel anything else. This was a long and arduous process, and Luo Fan was well aware of it. Faced with this situation, he wasn't the slightest bit discouraged, nor did he hesitate. He just wholeheartedly urged his will, trying his best to materialize the worldview that he had sorted out and expand it bit by bit outside his body. Every time he expanded by 10 units, he would be crushed by the terrifying pressure from the outside world. It could be said that almost all of his efforts were in vain. However, even so, Luo Fan was still not discouraged. He continued to push forward his worldview by 0.1 units at a time, allowing his worldview to expand outwards in the process. In this state, Luo Fan's perception of the passage of time in the outside world had been concealed. However, this was only the perception of the passage of time in the outside world. As long as his mind was not concealed, it would be impossible for his perception of time to disappear completely. Therefore, at this time, in a state where he only achieved 0.1 units of results after advancing 10 units, his perception of time began to gradually pass. Before he knew it, millions of years had already passed. Over the past millions of years, he had been in indescribable pain and suffering at every single moment. During this process, his worldview gradually took shape outside his body. Gradually, it formed a light and shadow that looked like a broken world, completely enveloping him. If this light and shadow of a broken world were established by itself, ordinary cultivators wouldn't even pay attention to it. Even the world established by an innate Zenith Heaven Realm cultivator would probably be countless times more perfect than this broken world. However, it was precisely this kind of broken light and shadow at this time for Luo Fan that was where his greatest reliance was. At this moment, as he floated in this broken world, when the light and shadow of this world finally reached a certain boundary, he finally, for the first time, truly isolated himself from the pressure from the outside world that was constantly acting on him, or rather, constantly acting on his worldview. This isolation was naturally not because the pressure had been completely eliminated by him. Instead, his worldview was already strong enough at this time to completely take over the pressure and no longer let it continue acting on him. In other words, it continued to make him feel that endless, terrifying pain. Success. At this moment, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. With this thought, he looked in all directions. This broken world light and shadow appeared in his eyes. Everything here was condensed bit by him, so he was naturally very familiar with this kind of broken light and shadow. At a glance, everything was so clear to him, and there was nothing to be surprised about. In fact, because this broken world light and shadow had taken over the pressure that made him feel pain at all times, he even felt an inexplicable sense of familiarity with this broken light and shadow at this time. His gaze continued to spread outwards, and in the end, it replaced the perspective of this broken light and shadow. For the first time, he began to clearly see the place that he had entered for millions of years. It was a boundless black curtain. This kind of black curtain covered the sky and covered the earth, covering the sky and the sun, completely covering everything in the outside world. It's indeed a simulated state of chaos. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh, an inexplicable joy appearing on his face. All of this proved that his original guess was correct. It proved that he had already grasped the clues of the seventh great calamity. At this moment, through the perspective brought about by this worldview, he felt for the first time that there were endless mysterious existences hidden behind the boundless black curtain. This kind of miraculous existence was like a perfect world in the state of chaos, a great world. There were even layers of chaos. As for why the simulation of this chaotic state was in the form of a canopy instead of the grayish and mysterious state, Rode couldn't understand why. The reason was actually very simple. It was because the simulation of the state of chaos at this time was not a direct simulation of the state of chaos, but a simulation of its mechanism. The simulation of the form was like copying a famous painting, which was to directly depict the appearance of the famous painting through various means. If one wanted to make it as identical as possible, it would be best if the two could be placed together so that no one could tell who was who. However, the simulation of the mechanism was different. It was the same as obtaining nutrients from a famous painting and simulating it from the mechanism. However, it was like analyzing the essence of the famous painting, determining why it became a famous painting, and determining that the famous painting used some techniques and secrets that other paintings didn't have. Then, it directly borrowed the same techniques and secrets to create another painting. In this case, the appearance of the painting obtained would not be the same as the original painting. In the past, what Luo Fan saw was the gray and misty simulation of the state of chaos, which looked like he was really looking at the state of chaos. It was like a copy of the state of chaos. At this time, the boundless black curtain that Luo Fan saw was a simulation of the special mechanism of the state of chaos. When copying a painting, no matter how hard one tried to copy it to be exactly the same as the original painting, there would still be a world of difference between it and the original painting. No matter how similar it was just a kind of imitation or even plagiarism. However, if one simulated the mechanism and borrowed the techniques and secrets contained in it, it would be different. Perhaps the value of the painting obtained in the end might not be much lower than that of the famous painting. If one had to use an analogy, directly copying the famous painting was equivalent to plagiarism. Borrowing the techniques was equivalent to learning from it. No matter what, plagiarism would be condemned by others. On the other hand, learning from it could bring forth the new, which was admirable. At this moment, the simulation of the state of chaos that Luo Fan encountered was obviously such a reference. This effect of learning from it allowed the simulation of the state of chaos to have a terrifying power that the simulations he had seen in the past did not have. At least, in the past millions of years, he could not break out of this simulation at all. He could not easily regain his sense of self and obtain the ability to move freely like he did in the past. After a long time, Luo Fan sighed with emotion to extract the mechanism of the state of chaos and completely ignore everything else. This simulation method is really terrifying. At this time, he could already confirm that his senses were correct. Behind the black curtain, there were bound to be countless existences like him hidden. In other words, existences like the perfect heaven and earth, or even other existences like the state of chaos. No matter how powerful the simulation of the state of chaos was, it was impossible for it to only be a small part of the place where he was. Even if it was just a simulation of a small part of the mechanism, what would be derived from it would inevitably be endless mysteries, endless heaven and earth, and endless matter. What about the requirements of the Great Tribulation? He thought of this question. One must know that although the surroundings seemed incredible, it was still his Great Tribulation after all. Since it was his Great Tribulation, it would naturally have a goal that could guide him to break through and guide him to move forward. This goal might be extremely grand, but might also be incomparably illusory. However, it still existed in the end. At least, in the previous few Great Tribulations, every time he stepped into the Great Tribulation, he could vaguely feel the existence of a direction. But this time, he was at a loss. That faint sense of direction had completely disappeared at this time. In a daze, he seemed to have really been thrown into an unfamiliar area that was purely a simulation of the state of chaos. It seemed that the entire simulation was just an adventure waiting for him to explore. There was no hidden restriction behind it all. This was the first time for him to experience such a situation. Perhaps this is because I still haven't sensed enough things. After being lost, he quickly set a goal for himself. At this moment, although he saw the black curtain around him, he guessed that he might be in a simulation of the state of chaos. However, after all, it was only the first time he saw it. He couldn't be more clear about how many things he could see. If it was said that he was surrounded by a boundless ocean, then the current him would at most be equivalent to coming into contact with the water around his body and realizing that his body had been wet by the seawater. As for how big the ocean he was in, where he was in the ocean, what treasures were hidden in the depths of the ocean, what dangers there were in the ocean, everything was still a secret to him. Under such circumstances, asking him to find out how he should pass through the ocean or find something in the ocean was obviously a pipe dream. Therefore, for the current him, it was more important to expand his perception so that he could have a deeper understanding of the simulated state of chaos around him. Chapter 2681. After gaining a clear understanding of his own state, Luo Fan calmed down and began to continue to materialize his own worldview. He worked hard to perfect the broken world around his body and make it as stable as possible so that he could do more in the boundless simulated chaotic state around him. This kind of perfection was naturally quite effective in the beginning. After all, he had materialized the worldview and turned it into an image of this broken world, but it was only an in-progress achievement. To be honest, this step was not his limit. At the very least, his worldview could still be materialized and perfected. In this way, at the very beginning, before his law worldview had reached its limit, the results of his hard work were naturally visible to the naked eye. The speed at which the worldview was materialized changed due to the influence of the external environment. In the ordinary area, even in the fifth level of the Tao Master's Road, it was extremely easy for Luo Fan to materialize the worldview with his ability. Just like before, the first step for him to build a stable dimensional structure was to first build his own worldview. And in a battle of that level, he could use this as a regular method of battle, which was enough to show how fast he could materialize the worldview. But obviously, that was just an ordinary area. In this great tribulation that simulated the chaotic state, the restrictions of this environment made it hundreds of millions of times more difficult for him to materialize the worldview, just like carrying Mount Tai over the North Sea. Under such circumstances, if he wanted to expand his worldview, it would naturally be impossible for him to do so quickly. If it weren't for this, he wouldn't have spent millions of years to materialize the worldview to the point where it could completely take over the cover of the chaotic state simulated by the outside world. Of course, similarly, if he wanted to take a step further and completely manifest his worldview of the laws so that the light and shadow of the world around him could attain the most perfect state that he could construct, then it would definitely take an extremely long period of time. In the end, after another few million years, he finally fully manifested his worldview of laws, allowing his worldview of laws to be fully manifested outside his body, making the light and shadow of the world around him more complete than ever. Even so, the light and shadow of the world were still rather broken. After doing this, he vaguely felt that there was something hidden in the depths of the boundless darkness around him. Or rather, something similar to the light and shadow of the world that his worldview had materialized. Sure enough, it's a simulation of the chaotic state mechanism. Feeling this, Luo Fan sighed in his heart. He was finally able to confirm his previous judgment. The boundless darkness in front of him, the almost absolute cover, was indeed a simulation of the chaotic state mechanism. The chaotic state mechanism was none other than the mechanism that could not be comprehended by those who were not true saints. The chaotic state contained everything, and possessed everything. The mysteries, principles, mysteries, and everything else that any living being could or could not imagine could be found in the chaotic state. Normally speaking, no matter what kind of comprehension ability a living being had, they should be able to find the mysteries and principles that they could understand in the chaotic state. It was just like a painting that depicted everything in the entire world. Those who were not omnipotent would not be able to clearly know how many things were in the painting, nor would they be able to understand the names and secrets of each thing in the painting. However, as long as one had a little common sense, they would definitely be able to find things that they knew and understood from the painting. The only difference was that knowledgeable people knew more things and understood more things. The chaotic state was supposed to be such a painting. However, compared to such a painting, the chaotic state was even more mysterious, profound, and unbelievable. Everything in the state of chaos was not arranged in a way that normal living beings could understand. They exist in a mixed state, in a state where there is me in you and you in me. In this situation, unless a living being could understand the fundamental mechanism of the state of chaos and the way these various existences were mixed, it would be impossible for them to understand anything or find any mysteries that they could comprehend from within unless they could understand the fundamental mechanism of the state of chaos and the way these existences were mixed. Whether one could understand the fundamental mechanism of the chaotic state was obviously a standard to differentiate between true saints and those who were not. Even though it was not a basic standard, it was still a standard. Therefore, to all beings below the true saint level, the chaotic state was something that could not be understood, sensed, or explored. They thought that they could sense, understand, and explore the chaotic state, but what they obtained was only the chaotic state that was distorted by their minds, or rather, their senses, their common sense, and their worldview. The difference between the chaotic state and the true chaotic state was definitely beyond the imagination of all living beings. Any living being that was not a true sage would enter the state of chaos. Even if they could not be eroded by the state of chaos, and could not be harmed by the state of chaos, the state of chaos that they saw seemed to be gray and seemed to be the true appearance of the state of chaos. However, in fact, it was actually the same as Luo Fan's previous observation of the state of chaos without the help of the worldview. In other words, everything that was hazy, the mysterious light and shadow that seemed to compress countless mysteries in front of him was actually no different from absolute concealment. In fact, even the black screen that Luo Fan saw with the help of the worldview could receive countless times more information than the gray and misty appearance. This was actually very easy to understand. The gray and misty scene was indeed the true chaotic state. Perhaps the entire chaotic state was indeed that kind of gray and misty appearance. When one entered it that way, what one saw was indeed the true chaotic state. However, that was just the appearance. How did the layers of chaotic state appear? Weren't those layers of chaotic state a part of the chaotic state? In that gray and misty scene, where did the layers of chaotic state go? In terms of the infinite nature of the chaotic state, even if it was divided into countless layers, the remaining part would still be in the original chaotic state. If the remaining chaotic state was taken out, it would be no different from the original complete state. Thinking from this perspective, it was obvious that there was no difference between observing and sensing the overall situation and directly sensing the remnants after isolating all the layers of chaotic state. There is no difference, and it might be meaningful for existences at the level of a true saint. They might be able to draw some conclusions or other conclusions from the difference. However, for those who are not true saints, it meant that looking at the true chaotic state was no different from being blind with their eyes open. The changes were unimaginably complicated, and even words could not accurately describe them. Simplifying this incomparably complex change over and over again, in the end, it was what Luo Fan was witnessing in the seventh Great Tribulation. The almost absolute concealment made him unable to sense his surroundings at all, let alone see his surroundings clearly. This simplified simulation of the mechanism seemed to be much worse than the simulation of the overall chaotic state in the past, and there seemed to be a considerable difference in level. However, the difficulty of dealing with the two was obviously the complete opposite of the difference in level. The simulation of the complete chaotic state could only simulate a part of the power of the disaster that descended from the chaotic state. This part of the power made the simulated chaotic state no longer absolute for existences below the true saint level. In the end, Luo Fan was able to use various other means to resist this simulation, and he relied on this method to survive the disasters again and again. But this time, the simulation of the mechanism was different. This was because it was just a simulation of one of the countless characteristics contained in the chaotic state, and it could even be considered an insignificant mechanism. Therefore, the degree of simulation of the disaster that came from the chaotic state was far greater than the simulation of the complete chaotic state. In other words, the difference between it and the true mechanism of the chaotic state was much smaller than the difference between the simulation of the complete chaotic state and the true chaotic state. Although it might be many times weaker than the mechanism possessed by the true state of chaos, it was no longer something that Luo Fan could resist by relying on tricks. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan couldn't even activate his own light of heaven and earth when he was completely concealed at that time. In the end, he relied on the true chaotic state and his unique worldview to barely break through the concealment, allowing himself to gain a foothold in the endless concealment, or rather, the endless simulated chaotic state. In fact, what he was doing now in the simulated chaotic state was what those true saints did in the chaotic state. Through the harvest of the treasure projection that he obtained in the land of opportunity, he already had some general understanding of the state of the chaotic state of a true saint. For true saints, they were in the chaotic state, but it was not like what he had understood in the past, where they could move around freely and manipulate the chaotic state as if it were air. They were in a state of chaos, but they also needed to use their own worldview to open up a layer that belonged to them in the state of chaos, and then continue to expand and promote this layer until it became truly stable and unshakable. As for how to expand and promote it, Luo Fan was still unclear. When he first came into contact with the projection of the treasure, he was completely confused. However, as time passed, and he continued to think deeply, he had a guess. Perhaps the way to expand and promote his chaotic state was to gain the recognition of other true saints. Whether this guess was correct or not, the great calamity this time was the best opportunity to test it out. At the thought of this, Luo Fan couldn't help but feel a little excited. At this time, he could vaguely feel that in the depths of the boundless darkness, there were hidden existences that could faintly resonate with the projection of his world of laws. Although it's still broken, it's also a world that's completely based on my worldview. Looking at the broken light and shadow of the world around him, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. With this thought, He took a deep breath, and with a turn of his mind, endless energy and matter emerged out of thin air in the shadow of the world. The time and space that were originally just illusory also quickly solidified. Boom, boom. Earth-shattering roars continuously appeared at this time in the surrounding broken light and shadow of the world. The entire world began to shake crazily, and the originally extremely strange and distorted light and shadow of the world began to quickly become orderly, as if the clear and turbid world was being divided. The original reason why the broken world was distorted was because the structure of time and space in it was not the structure of time and space in the normal world. The structure of time in the normal world, regardless of whether it was special or not, was still orderly after all. Even if it wasn't linear, there was still some kind of hidden order. As for space, there was no need to mention it. Space and time were incomparably closely related. If time was orderly, then space would naturally be orderly too. After all, Luo Fan's worldview was just a worldview. Even if it described everything in the world, it didn't really transform into the world. Therefore, the time and space in it were obviously abstract. Since they were abstract, they naturally couldn't be replaced with a real order to express it. This caused the light and shadow of the world to appear extremely distorted and chaotic. In fact, the distortion and chaos were also part of the reason why the world looked so broken. Chapter 2682. As the light and shadow of the world gradually appeared, Luo Fan gradually felt that the boundless darkness around him had begun to undergo various subtle changes. Faintly, there seemed to be strange specks of light gradually appearing in the darkness. These specks of light were extremely weak and faintly discernible. They flickered in the darkness as if they were flickering. Although the specks of light had already appeared, they weren't stable. They would appear and disappear suddenly, which was why they seemed to flicker indeterminately. The pressure on Luo Fan from the outside world also grew stronger and stronger with these changes. However, this increase in strength was equivalent to the degree of his world taking shape. As the pressure increased, so did the world. In this way, the two were still in an inexplicable state of balance. The increase in the pressure from the outside world wouldn't exceed the limits of what he could bear. The speed at which the world materialized from light and shadow into the real world wasn't slow at all. At the very least, it wasn't slow compared to when he tried his best to take shape of the world. In just a few short years, the entire world had taken shape. At this moment, the rumbling that had been echoing for several years finally stopped. The entire world no longer looked as broken as it had been before. Although the entire world was still full of flaws, damage, and all kinds of flaws that could only be discovered when one went deep into it. On the surface, this world seemed to be a complete, normal world. Everything that a normal world possessed, including the earth, sky, mountains, rivers, oceans, islands, and even plants and living beings could be found in this world. In fact, all sorts of sentient living beings were gradually being born, just like how normal living beings were born in a normal world. At this stage, the boundless darkness outside had already turned into a vast starry sky. Countless stars decorated the depths of the starry sky. Sparkling starlight crossed the boundless darkness of the starry sky and entered the world where Luo Fan was. Through the starlight, Luo Fan could feel that every star was a world of its own, an incomparably wonderful world that was born from a unique worldview. In other words, every world was an existence comparable to the world that Luo Fan had taken shape in. It was so much so that he could vaguely sense that there were existences amongst the countless worlds that were much more powerful and perfect than his own worldview of laws. These worlds naturally wouldn't emit light. At the very least, they weren't like the starlight that Luo Fan saw that constantly emitted light. The reason why there were lights in the countless heavens and earth in his eyes was because these lights were only the manifestation of Luo Fan's own perception. In other words, these heavens and earth themselves did not have any light. It was because Luo Fan had sensed the existence of these heavens and earth, received information from them, and separated them from the boundless darkness around them. This was why they seemed to be constantly glowing. Facing such a situation, Luo Fan took a deep breath. He knew that his next target would be the countless heavens and earth he was looking for. If a true sage opened up his own world in the state of chaos and created his own chaotic layer, what should they do? Luo Fan naturally didn't dare to think that he had a clear understanding of this. After all, he wasn't a true sage, and his way of thinking was worlds apart from a true sage's. How could he have the guts to think that he could see through a true sage? However, he knew that there was one thing that true sages had to do. That was to stabilize this part of the world and stabilize this layer of chaos. If they couldn't stabilize this world, if they couldn't let this chaos layer truly stabilize, then why did they open up this world? Why did they create this chaos layer? This was the case for true sages in the state of chaos. In that case, what Luo Fan needed to do now was obviously the same in the seventh major calamity. Although he didn't know what the test of the major calamity this time was and how he would survive it in the end, it was a necessary process. However, it was a necessary process to stabilize one's own world of laws in the chaotic state simulated by the Great Tribulation so that it would not be easily destroyed. It was obviously not a simple task to completely stabilize the world of laws and prevent it from being eroded and destroyed by the simulated chaotic state. At this moment, he could clearly feel that the countless starlight, or rather, the countless worlds, were rejecting him. This rejection was constantly transmitted to his world of laws through the starlight. At this moment, his world of laws hadn't changed because of this and wouldn't collapse because of this. However, this was only temporary. As time passed, this influence would definitely continue to increase and increase. One day, when this rejection grew to a certain limit, what awaited him would naturally be the collapse of the world. At that time, would he return to the state he was in when he first stepped into this simulated chaotic state, and everything he knew would be completely concealed, or would he fail the tribulation and be completely erased? He obviously couldn't be sure of this at this moment. However, he had to admit that the latter possibility did exist. Rejection. Is this the rejection of different worldviews? Luo Fan thought to himself as he sensed the faint rejection coming from the countless starlight. The countless worlds were derived from unique worldviews. These worldviews were fundamentally different from all other worldviews in the chaotic state. As a worldview itself, it wasn't a big deal for it to be different from other worldviews. As long as the owner of the worldview agreed with this worldview, then this worldview would be established. However, if this worldview was to be put outside the present and turn the world that followed this worldview into reality, then things wouldn't be so simple. What did a unique worldview represent? It represented that this worldview was something that only you agreed with and no one else agreed with. Any existence that wanted to survive eternally in the chaotic state would need to establish their own unique worldview. In other words, any chaotic layer that existed in the chaotic state itself followed a completely different worldview from other chaotic layers. The owners of these chaotic layers had their own unique understanding of heaven and earth, the world, space-time, all living things, chaos, and everything else. Once one reached the true sage level, then this worldview would definitely be perfect. At least, in Luo Fan's opinion, it should already be perfect. It could explain everything and encompass everything. And all of this naturally included those worlds, or rather, those chaotic layers that were created by the new true saint that was born in the state of chaos. If it was placed in this simulated state of chaos, in other words, among the stars in the sky, the worldview of any star or any creator of the world, according to their own will, would need to include the world that Luo Fan had opened up at this time. Only by including this world, in other words, everything in this world would have to be explained, consistent, and stable in their own worldview. If all the masters of the lands here were at the true sage level, the lands they created would be perfect and would be great lands. Naturally, there would be nothing to say. As a perfect world or a great world, the worldview that they followed would definitely be perfect. That kind of worldview would naturally be able to explain everything. It could include all the worlds that had appeared, all the worlds that had yet to appear, and even all living things. In that case, the true sage who first created a perfect world in the chaotic state would naturally be able to equate the worldview of the later true sages through some changes. In other words, those true sages who first created a perfect world in the chaotic state were not worried that their foundations would be shaken because of the worlds created by the later true sages. Even if they were unable to accept and equate the two worldviews, it was only because the later true sages were not real true sages. They still had weaknesses and flaws. With such confidence, they would naturally not have any thoughts of rejecting the later true sages. Of course, there might be some tests. However, that was only the case in the true chaotic state. In this simulated chaotic state, the situation was completely different. The simulated chaotic state was ultimately just a simulated chaotic state. The worlds that appeared were naturally only simulations of the perfect world. They could not be the worlds created by the true sages. Since it was not the world created by the true sages, the worldview that they followed naturally could not be the perfect worldview. In this way, the creators of the world naturally could not have the confidence that their worldview could explain everything in other worldviews and explain everything in the world that was born based on other worldviews. In this case, one could imagine what the creators of the world would think of the latecomers. To them, the appearance of any latecomer could subvert their worldview and make them discover some key loopholes in their worldview. If it was only a worldview, then there would still be a chance to make up for this loophole. It could be made up for through incomparably complicated settings. However, the situation would be different after it was truly materialized into a world. At this step, if one discovered that there were loopholes and weaknesses in one's worldview, it would be equivalent to removing a large part of the supporting foundation of the world that one had created. The result would definitely be the collapse of one's own world. And the collapse of one's own world meant that the achievements that one had made in the billions of years after creating this world would be completely wasted. In this case, how could the creators of the world not reject the latecomers? What would they do to reject the latecomers? Of course, they would think of ways to destroy the latecomers' world first. If the world created by the latecomers was destroyed, then it would mean that the world created by the latecomers was just that and nothing much. Since the world created by the latecomers was nothing much, it also meant that the worldview that they sorted out was also just that and nothing much. Since the worldview was nothing much, then the things in the worldview that one's own worldview could not explain would naturally be the other party's fault and not one's own worldview. In this case, one's foundation would not be damaged, and one's worldview would still be flawless. That would be great. At this moment, this rejection was acting on Luo Fan's world of laws through the countless starlight. Through the rejection from the starlight, Luo Fan clearly knew what his world of laws would encounter next. He also knew what his world of laws would encounter if it wanted to truly exist in this simulated state of chaos. A test, huh? In this case, it's not bad. At least I have a target, Luo Fan thought to himself with a faint smile on his face. Where there was hostility, there would be battles, and battles were obviously the main theme of the Great Tribulation. Perhaps this kind of battle was the test of the Great Tribulation this time. The countless stars were not randomly distributed. Although they looked very similar, one would be able to tell that they were not really random after taking a closer look. Between the countless stars, they were divided into pieces. Vaguely, a large number of stars gathered together to form a huge system that resembled a galaxy. The structure of these systems was rather complicated, and the characteristics of the stars within them, or rather, the world itself, were somewhat similar. It was as if they were connected to each other. Are those the simulated chaotic layers? After carefully distinguishing the systems, Luo Fan made a guess. This guess was actually not difficult to come up with. He had actually seen what the chaotic layers looked like before. For example, the negative emotion universe layer, the traffic layer, and the opportunity layer. These were all chaotic layers that truly existed in the state of chaos. Among those chaotic layers, the world was obviously not the only one.